As with any expansion, Cataclysm is set to bring a ton of changes into the game, none more so than to our classes. And whatever you intend on playing, from Priest to Paladin, Warrior to Warlock, or anything in between, there is a lot to look forwards to here. So let's see what's changed. This is my ultimate class video for Cataclysm Classic. By the end of Wrath of the Lich King, Paladin was one of, if not the best, at pretty much everything they could do. Protection had been an S tier tank since the expansion dropped, Holy had always been at the top of healing meters, and though Retribution took a while to catch up, once you had some tier 10 gear, and of course a Shadowmourne, they were also among the top DPS. It's gonna be pretty hard to top that, but in Cataclysm, Paladins were one of the classes that underwent quite the shake-up in terms of how they work, trading a cooldown based rotation for a more resourced focused one. But with a tank, healer and a DPS to cover, we've got plenty to get through today, so let's talk about the Paladin in Cataclysm. First up, we have our baseline class changes. While the biggest addition has to be Holy Power, I find that people either love or hate this new resource, and it's something I'd give a try for yourself to see if you enjoy it. In short, Paladins can now generate this resource through a variety of abilities and talents. Your smaller cooldown abilities, which you use a lot, will grant 1 Holy Power, and you can have up to 3, and then you spend Holy Power on very strong abilities, which scale with how much Holy Power is spent. I guess the idea here was to give Paladin more to do than just pressing each ability when it comes off of cooldown, but it's a very important part of the class in Cata, and, well, for future expansions as well, I suppose. I'll get more into details of Holy Power builders and spenders as we talk about each spec. What's new in the Holy Tree then? Well, Lay on Hands is now down to a 10-minute cooldown baseline, and Divine Play has been toned down quite a bit, now having a 2-minute cooldown and restoring 12% max mana. Also, Cleanse will not remove magical effects by default now either. New to Holy is the general healing rework that all healers have seen. Flash of Light is your fast and inefficient big heal, Holy Light is your slow and efficient moderate heal, and new is Divine Light, which is your slow and efficient big heal. Seal of Insight is new and kind of just combines the on-hit effects of Seal of Wisdom and Light. Holy Radiance is another new addition. This targeted ability applies a moderate AoE heal and then a heal over time for a few seconds to all nearby targets. And you also get Word of Glory. This is a single target Holy Power spender that will heal an ally depending on how much Holy Power was spent. Over in the Protection tree, Blessing of Kings has had a bunch of resistances added onto it and now shares a buff slot with Mark of the Wild. Divine Protection has also changed to a 20% damage reduction effect, now on a 1-minute cooldown. New for Protection is Resistance Aura. This simply combines all your existing resistance auras together into one button. You also get Guardian of Ancient Kings. This is a big 5-minute cooldown, which changes depending on your primary specialization. For Holy, it duplicates the next 5 direct heals you do and causes 10% of the amount healed to affect nearby allies. For Protection, it reduces all damage taken by 50% for 12 seconds, and for Ret, your Guardian lasts 30 seconds, and whilst it's active, attacks will grant 1% strength per application, and at the end of the duration, you'll deal damage to all nearby targets, scaling with the number of stacks you built up. For Retribution, Judgment is reworked once again, so you don't have 3 judgments anymore, it's just now 1 ability, which does something different depending on your active seal. Another new thing is Seal of Truth, which is essentially just what Seal of Vengeance was. It stacks a debuff where you deal bonus weapon damage at max stacks, and your judgment damage will scale with the amount of stacks as well. Blessing of Might has had a mini rework. It now gives 20% melee attack power, 10% ranged attack power, and restores some mana. And Crusader Strike is no longer a talent and is used by all specs to generate Holy Power. New for Ret is Rebuke. Paladins get a kick, 10-second cooldown, 4-second spell score lockout. Pretty simple. You also get Inquisition. Consume Holy Power to increase holy damage by 30% with a 4-second duration per Holy Power consumed. Those are our baseline changes. Let's head over to the talent trees and see what else we have. So when you pick Holy, you gain Holy Shock, which works very similar to how it has for a long time. It deals damage to an enemy or it heals an ally. It will also grant 1 Holy Power now as well. You get Walk in the Light, which gives you 10% bonus healing, a further 30% healing to Word of Glory, Glory and removes its cooldown. Meditation allows 50% of your in-combat mana regen from Spirit to continue, and your mastery is Illuminated Healing. Your direct heals place an absorb shield on the target for a percentage of the initial amount healed. In the tree, Protector of the Innocent heals you whenever you heal another target, which is just a very consistent way to keep your health bar going up. Judgments of the Pure gives 9% casting and melee haste for 1 minute after judging, and causes a further 30% of mana from Spirit to continue regenerating in combat. This talent is good for all kinds of Pala specs. The old versions of Divine Favor and Divine Illumination have kind of been combined together into one new talent. This new 3-minute cooldown, still called Divine Favor, increases casting speed and crit chance by 20% for 20 seconds. Daybreak is brand new and makes your main heals have a 20% chance to cause your next Holy Shock to have no cooldown. Sacred Cleansing adds a magic dispel back onto Cleanse, so only Holy Paladins can do this during Kata, remember that. Beacon of Light gets changed up a bit now. It will only duplicate 50% of the heals given to the beacon, and only Holy Light will copy 100% of the heal, but it does last 5 minutes now, so really you're only going to have to refresh it once, maybe twice per boss fight. Conviction is new and effectively gives you 9% bonus healing after critting 3 times, which is of course amazing. Paragon of Virtue lowers the cooldown on your big buttons, just letting you press them more and doing more healing. And Tower of Radiance causes your heals on your beacon target to grant holy power, as well as causing Holy Radiance to do so as well. And finally is Light of Dawn. This consumes all holy power to heal the 6 most injured targets in front of you. It's finally some decent on-demand raid healing for the Paladin, and alongside Divine Radiance, this should keep Paladins feeling relevant, whether they're single target healing or more focusing on the raid. Holy uses glyphs such as Divine Favor for a better duration on it, Insight for just more healing, and Word of Glory to improve this ability a little bit more. Protection is also getting quite a few changes in their talents too, including dealing quite a bit more damage. When you pick this tree, you'll get Avenger's Shield, which is an instant cast ability that deals high threat, as well as silencing targets. Touch by the Light increases stamina by 15%, spell hit by 8%, and increases spell power by 60% of your strength. Vengeance is a new passive across all tanks, and in short, when you take damage, you deal more damage that scales with how much maximum health you have. Judgments of the Wise is just there to make sure you won't be going and your mastery is Divine Bulwark, which just increases your chance to block melee attacks. In your talents, Blessing of Sanctuary is gone and is now kind of a passive type talent with a similar effect, both in that it reduces damage taken and restores mana. Wrath of the Lightbringer adds some more damage to your core abilities to keep you up there on the threat table. And Hammer of the Righteous will replace Crusader Strike on AoE and is no longer target capped either. It will also generate 1 holy power. Grand Crusader gives Hammer of the Righteous and Crusader Strike a chance to reset the cooldown on Avenger's Shield and cause it to grant 1 holy power as well. And Shield of the Righteous has been changed into a holy power spender that will deal more damage based upon how many charges were used. You still have Divine Guardian as a prot pally too, and it's now prot exclusive. However, it's a raid-wide 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds, so it's still very powerful. Shield of the Templar reduces the cooldown on your big abilities and makes it so Divine Plea grants 3 holy power. And finally is a reworked Ardent Defender that's now an active cooldown. It will reduce damage taken by 20% for 10 seconds, and if you would have taken a lethal hit while it's active, you'll instead heal 15% max health. Protection would use glyphs such as Shield of the Righteous for more damage, Seal of Truth where expertise matters, and perhaps Hammer of the Righteous for more AoE threat. And finally we have the big two-handed light-wielding Crusader, the Retribution Paladin. Your main talent tree ability is the brand new holy power spender, Templar's Verdict. This deals heavy single target damage. You gain 25% bonus damage with two-handed weapons, as well as Sheath of Light to increase your spell power by 30% of your attack power, and you also get 8% spell hit. it. Judgment of the Bold is similar to what proc gets, it's just there to keep your mana bar good, and your mastery is Hand of Light, making your Crusader Strike, Divine Storm, and Templar's Verdict do bonus damage as Holy. Eye for an Eye is changed up quite a bit, and now all magic attacks have a 40% chance to cause 30% of the damage taken back to the caster with a small internal cooldown. Improved Judgment and Long Arm of the Law makes you be able to keep in range of targets easier via a 45% move speed buff if you judge a target that's 15 or more yards away. Art of War gets changed to give auto attacks a 20% chance to make your next exorcism instant and to cause 100% bonus damage. Divine Storm is moved way up the talent tree and its cooldown is way lower. It will also grant 1 holy power if it hits at least 4 targets. And Sanctity of Battle is another new talent that causes haste effects to lower the cooldown of Crusader Strike and Divine Storm. Sacred Shield is now found in the Ret tree as a passive which can occur once per minute, and it will grant a large shield and increase healing received by 20%. Seal of Command is also a passive and will modify Seal of Righteousness to deal AoE damage. Divine Purpose is one of your most fun and rotation-changing abilities in the talent tree. It makes a whole list of abilities have a 15% chance to make your next holy power spender free and act as if 3 holy power was spent. Acting fast on these procs can really separate good from the great ret players in Cata. Inquiry of Faith increases the periodic damage on Seal of Truth and increases the duration of Inquisition by 200%, so it's way easier to maintain. Finally, we have a new end of talent tree ability, Zealotry, a 2-minute cooldown that costs 3 holy power to activate, and it will make Crusader Strike generate 3 holy power charges for the next 20 seconds. This is going to allow you to fire off back-to-back Templar's Verdicts and gives you a huge burst window with all your cooldowns running. Ret uses prime glyphs such as Exorcism to add a damage over time portion onto it, Truth to help with expertise where needed, and Templar's Verdict to buff its damage up that much more. So how are we expecting Paladins to shape up in PvE content then throughout Cataclysm? Well, I reckon the spec you'll see the most of is gonna be somewhat similar to Wrath, and that is the Holy Paladin. They still have that role as the go-to tank healer that can push out single target heals that others just struggle to compete with. And though Beacon was nerfed to be 50% effective on many spells, they still just remain that good. Holy Paladins also gain good raid-wide healing now thanks to Holy Radiance and Light of Dawn, so they can help out on times where many players need help at the same time. And of course, Paladins just always bring excellent utility. You might not have Divine Sacrifice anymore as Holy, but you have Divine Favor, Aura Mastery, Wings, Hand of Sacrifice, Freedom, Protection, the list just goes on. You really cannot go wrong with a Holy Paladin either in a 10 or 25 player raid group. Next most popular I reckon will be Ret. Ret should be a strong one-off pickup in most raids that offer good single target damage and AoE damage. I'd say gameplay changes are most noticeable across the various Paladin specs for Ret specifically. Not only do you now have the builder spender style with Holy Power, but you also have the manager maintenance buff with Inquisition as well, which won't be for everyone and is definitely a big departure from Wrath's Ret, where you kind of just press your buttons in the correct order as they come off of cooldown. I also find that Ret can kind of pop off in Cata or feel slow depending on how lucky you get. Of course, you have your big opener on pull with Zealotry, Guardian and Wings, but then sometimes it can feel as though there's downtime where your Art of War and Divine Purpose just aren't proccing, and it's like you're sitting there waiting for something cool to happen. But when Ret works, it really works, and it can be a fast-paced and rewarding spec to play well. Definitely one to try out during pre-patch, or maybe some leveling dungeons if we're past that, and to get a feel for if it's for you this expansion. Finally, Protection, and this is not me trying to make out as though it's a bad tank or anything, because that would not be true. But yeah, it's not going to be as powerful as it was in Wrath in Cata. I mean, in Wrath it was a main tank which had cheat death. How did that ever get into the game in the first place? But anyways, Protection Paladin packs a ton of powerful defensive cooldowns such as Guardian of Ancient Kings, Divine Guardian, Divine Protection, Ardent Defender, but outside of cooldowns, they're gonna be taking more damage than some other tanking choices. Also, your Mastery, Divine Bulwark, just increases your chance to block melee attacks, but what if a boss were to, say, do some magic damage? Then it's not quite so good. Also, your big holy power spender is Shield of the Righteous, which just does a bunch of damage. I mean, threat is nice and everything, threat's good, but you'd have wanted to see some kind of damage reduction effect on this too, which is what Blizzard ended up doing in Mists of Pandaria, by the way. Also, you'd really want to be main tanking on a prot pally, which puts you up against Blood DK, and Blood DK is just really stacked in Cata. So I do think there are one or two problems with prot pala in Cata as they are, but it's not as though they're totally unviable or won't see play. They just won't be as popular as they were during Wrath. I think that's the situation. When it comes to PvP, Paladin is also going to feel quite different to Wrath as a whole. The hybrid preg spec, which you're probably all too familiar with if you did lots of Wrath Arena, won't be a thing anymore due to general talent changes. So if you see a damage dealing Paladin, they're probably going to be Ret. Some important talent additions for Ret in PvP will be Selfless Healer, reducing the cooldown on Word of Glory by 10 seconds and increasing its effectiveness by 50% when used on others. You as the casting Paladin also get a 4% damage buff for 10 seconds, stacking up to 3 times with 3 holy powers spent. So this is a fantastic bit of group-wide utility. Acts of Sacrifice reduce the cooldown and mana cost of your important hand abilities by 20%, and make it so Cleanse will also remove 1 movement impairing effect on yourself. Remember, Cleanse doesn't remove magic by default anymore in Cata, so this can be a nice way to get out of magical and even physical movement impairing effects if you have something to dispel. Ret can act as a strong burst spec with great supportive tools, but it can be somewhat vulnerable to being hard focused due to a lack of personal cooldowns at their disposal. Nevertheless, I'm sure skilled players will find a way to make it work. Holy Paladin, just like in Wrath though, continues to be quite the amazing spec in PvP, though again your playstyle is gonna feel a bit different. Holy Power and Word of Glory spam, thanks to it having no cooldown when you're this spec, is gonna carry a lot of your healing output. Daybreak and Infusion of Light will keep those holy shocks rolling in, and then you can top up people with huge divine lights. You bring a strong set of cooldowns similar to PvE, such as Divine Favor and Aura Mastery, and you passively just take a lot less damage than some other healing choices, just through the virtue of being in full plate with a shield and being able to throw on Resistance Aura. Overall, Holy Paladin should feel like a surprisingly mobile healer that can actually do a bunch on the move now, and whilst your big heals will be carrying you hard, it's a lot more of a fluid gameplay style than what we have in Wrath. Let's move on and check out some tier set bonuses for the Paladin. Tier 11 is the Reinforced Saffron set from Throne of the Four Winds, Blackwing Descent, and Bastion of Twilight. For Holy, the 2 set increases the crit chance of Holy Light, and the 4 set grants 540 Spirit for 6 seconds after having casted Holy Shock. So a bit of extra crit on one of your main heals, and some bonus Spirit, which should pretty much always be active. Not bad, not super exciting either. For protection, Crusader Strike will deal 10% more damage on your 2 set, and Guardian of Ancient Kings will last 50% longer on your 4 set. Crusader Strike is used on single target as a main way to generate holy power, so it's a bit of extra threat there, and the Guardian of Ancient Kings buff will take it up to an 18-second duration on a 50% damage reduction, so pretty strong. For Ret, they have 10% more damage on Templar's Verdicts for the 2 set, and the 4 set will extend the duration of Inquisition as if you'd spent an extra holy power. So just more damage on your biggest attack and an easier time on your maintenance buff. Seems fairly good. Tier 12 is the Immolation set from the Firelands. For Holy, the 2 set makes it so Holy Shock has a 40% chance to grant you 6% of your base mana when cast. That should be about 1400 mana when it procs, and given Holy Shock is a bigger part of your toolkit now, this should make it a great mana restoration tool. The 4 set makes it so Flash of Light, Holy Light, and Divine Light also heal a nearby target for 10% of the initial amount. So if you played this spec in Wrath, you'll know about about a little thing called Glyph of Holy Light, which doesn't exist in Cata anymore. So it seems as though they've kind of brought back a weaker version of it for the tier set. Nevertheless, the glyph was very strong, so this seems okay as well. For protection, the 2 set makes Shield of the Righteous do 20% more damage as fire, and the 4 set gives you 12% parry chance for 10 seconds after Divine Protection fades. A bit more threat and a bit more mitigation for prot there. And for ret, the 2 set makes Crusader Strike do bonus fire damage, and the 4 set increases the duration of Zealotry by 15 seconds. That 4 set is kinda huge though, that's 75% more uptime on your main cooldown, and that will extend its duration to nearly fully match Heroism as well. That sounds pretty fun to get. Finally, we have tier 13 from Dragon Soul. So it appears as though a bunch of the tier 13 Paladin set bonuses went through changes in later expansions, so they still weren't worth using. But I'm gonna try and go over the ones here which I believe will be correct. For Holy, the 2 set reduces mana cost of spells by 25% for 15 seconds after having used Divine Favor, and the 4 set increases the healing of Holy Radiance by 20%, though I suspect this was nerfed down to 5% at some point. For protection, the 2 set makes Judgment grant an absorb shield equal to 25% of damage dealt, so just a nice bit of mitigation, and the 4 set reduces the cooldown on Divine Guardian by 1 minute and increases its range by 70 yards. So that's a 2-minute cooldown, 100 yard range, 20% raid wide damage reduction for 6 seconds. That's pretty good. Finally, Retribution. The 2 set makes it so Judgment will grant 1 holy power, and the 4 set increases damage done while Zealotry is active by 18%. I think this was nerfed to 12% at some point before being totally changed in a later expansion. Either way, it's a ton more damage during your big burst window, so should be a lot of fun to use. Since vanilla, Warrior has kind of followed a similar format. It feels not very great whilst leveling, it has a slow start in early raids, it starts to pick up midway through an expansion, and by the final raid tier with loads of gear, they're an unstoppable machine of destruction. And I can tell you Cataclysm is about to break that cycle. In this expansion, you skip over all the scaling problems and get straight to the good stuff right away. All this thanks to an overhaul to your resource, Rage, but more on that in a moment. Both new races in Goblin and Worgen can of course roll a warrior, and even Blood Elves can now be warriors in Cata too, so whichever race you're playing, you can roll as this class. The warrior is sure to be in a great spot in Cata, so let's check it out and see how good warriors were back then. So what is new baseline with the warrior? Well, the big change is to Rage. So if you've been a long time warrior enjoyer, you may remember talks of Rage normalization during TBC, but this was more of a recalculation of how warriors filled up their red bar. It was still centered around the idea of the more damage you do, the more rage you get, and that's why by the end of practically every expansion so far, warriors just end up being insane as their auto attack damage is filling up their rage bar constantly. Cataclysm, however, was the real rage normalization expansion, so here's how it's going to work. Rage will no longer be generated based on the damage of your auto attacks. Instead, each auto attack will now provide a set amount of rage, and offhands will generate 50% as much. Your weapon speed will also be factored into this to keep you generating about the same amount of rage. If you crit, you'll generate double rage, and haste effects will improve swing speed and therefore rage generation. Also, rage generated from damage taken will be based on your health. So that's going to be how rage works. Let's look at what else you've got changing baseline. Battle Stance will now cause you to do 5% more damage and take 5% less damage. And Heroic Strike is now an instant attack, not next swing. And just on this point, there are no more next swing attacks in Cata anymore, they're all instant. So Heroic Strike, Maul, Cleave, any others you can think of. New is Strike. This is just a button you press before you get Heroic Strike, and you won't really notice it if you have a level cap character. And you also get Colossus Smash. This is a 20-second cooldown which bypasses 100% of an enemy's armor for 6 seconds, and it's also less effective against players. Another change in Cata is that armor penetration as a stat is gone, so Blizzard can now make abilities like this. Obviously, you're going to want to put as much damage as you physically can into that 6-second window to get the most out of it. In the Fury tree, Berserker stance will now cause you to deal 10% more damage. Victory Rush will heal 20% max health. Battle Shout now grants strength and agility, and both Battle Shout and Commanding Shout are now on a 1-minute cooldown, generate 20 rage, and share a cooldown. For Whirlwind, the cooldown will be reduced by 6 seconds if it hits 4 or more targets. Demoralizing Shout will reduce physical damage dealt by an enemy by 10%, and Recklessness gets a big buff compared to Wrath. Special attacks will have 50% bonus crit chance, lasting 12 seconds. Slam is castable whilst moving, and its cast time is further lowered by haste effects. Enrage Regeneration still heals 30% max health over 10 seconds, but it doesn't remove enrages anymore. However, you can't get new ones whilst it's active. New to Fury is Inner Rage, which reduces the cooldown on Heroic Strike and Cleave by 50% for 15 seconds. These two abilities share a cooldown, and with this buff active, you'll be able to use them every single global. So this is going to be a lot of damage with cooldowns up. You get Rallying Cry, which is 20% increased max health for all party and raid members for 10 seconds. Bit like Last Stand, but raid-wide, so very strong. And you get an absolutely iconic warrior ability, Heroic Leap. Definitely one of my favourite abilities that they've ever put on the class. A relatively short 1-minute cooldown, and it allows warriors to leap through the air, dealing damage upon arrival, and just getting where they need to be. In Protection, Defensive Stance is now 10% less damage taken, and you generate way more threat. Shield Block has been reworked. It's now on a 1-minute cooldown and increases block chance by 25%. If your total mitigation including block exceeds 100%, excess block will be converted to critical block, which is simply just blocking double. Also, block, now baseline, prevents 30% of incoming damage in Cataclysm instead of just a flat amount. So in other words, a critical block will be stopping 60% of incoming damage. Shield Wall is nerfed a bit, down from a 60% damage reduction to 40%. And Stance Mastery is buffed. You now retain 25 rage when swapping stances, up from 10. So those are our baseline changes, quite a few of them for the warrior. Things are going to feel a little bit different, but let's get into the talent trees and see what else we have. We'll make a start with arms. When you pick arms, you get Mortal Strike, the big iconic hard-hitting ability we all know and love. However, you should know that Mortal Strike effects have been reduced down from 50% effectiveness to 25% in Kata. You'll also deal 12% more damage with two-handed weapons, generate 1 rage per second whilst in combat, and 25% more rage from damage dealt. Your mastery gives melee attacks a chance to proc an extra attack. It's kind of like the old sword spec which we lost in Wrath of the Lich King. In the talent tree, we've got a bunch of changes here. Field Dressing increases all healing received, as well as making self-healing effects more powerful. Blitz is new and makes charge generate more rage and stun up to 2 nearby additional targets. Drums of War can make pummel, as well as your utility shouts free to cast, but you tend to have enough rage to spend in Kata. Impale now only increases the crit damage bonus of Mortal Strike, Slam, and Overpower instead of all abilities. Sweeping Strike goes from a 30-second cooldown and next 5 attacks in Wrath to a 1-minute cooldown, but it affects all attacks for 10 seconds in Kata. Massive buff for this ability. This can give warriors an enormous burst window on 2 targets. Improved Slam now has a 20% damage buff thrown in, as well as its reduced cast time, and yes, you're going to be using this in PvE. Deadly Calm is another new addition on a 2-minute cooldown. It makes your abilities cost 0 rage for 10 seconds. Goes without saying, but this is going to line up pretty well with your other cooldowns. Blood Frenzy, in addition to its previous effects, makes auto attacks have a chance to generate 20 rage. And you also have Lance to the Slaughter, which makes Mortal Strike refresh Rend and increases the damage of other abilities. Throwdown is a new PvP focused ability on a 45-second cooldown that stuns a target for 5 seconds. You can also flex a point into this for PvE content if needed. It can be nice to have. And finally is Blade Storm, which gets buffed through the roof in Kata. First up, it's 150% weapon damage every second, not just a copy of Whirlwind, but the big deal is instead of it being target capped at 4 enemies, it hits everything around you, so this can be an insane cooldown. Arms take some pretty straightforward prime glyphs, just aimed at increasing their main ability damage, such as Mortal Strike, Overpower, and Slam. Fury next. When you pick this spec, you get Bloodthirst, which is an instant attack that restores a small amount of health. Dual wield spec that allows you to dual wield and increases offhand weapon damage by 25%, precision for 3% more hit and 40% more auto attack damage, and your mastery is Unshackled Fury, which increases the benefit of abilities that cause or require you to be enraged. Battle Trance is new, making your spec's core talent abilities have a chance to make your next ability that costs more than 5 rage free. And you get Executioner. This is a big new talent, which when you execute will increase your attack speed by 5%, stacking 5 times. So this is going to mean an even better execute phase for warriors. And yes, if you're playing arms, you would spec into this as well for sure. Death Wish still makes you do 20% more damage, but you now receive 20% more damage too, up from 5% in Wrath. Raging Blow is a new short cooldown active ability which instantly strikes with both melee weapons, only usable whilst enraged. Meat Cleaver makes Cleave and Whirlwind increase their damage by 10%, stacking up to 3 times, and Skirmisher reduces the cooldown on your mobility such as Intercept and Heroic Leap even more. Finally, we have a choice at the bottom of the talent tree. You can still go Titan's Grip, which no longer has a damage penalty, and of course this will allow you to equip 2 two-handed weapons. Or you have the new Single-Minded Fury. This also increases damage by 20% and makes Slam hit with both weapons. Fury uses prime glyphs such as Bloodthirst, Raging Blow, and Slam. Again, just some simple damage increases. Next up we have Protection. When you pick this talent tree, you get Shield Slam. Pretty similar to how it's always worked in that it deals a bunch of damage, but that damage now scales with attack power. You get Sentinel for 15% bonus stamina and block chance, and 50% more rage from targets that are not targeting you. Vengeance makes it so each time you take damage, you gain 5% of that damage as attack power up to 10% of your max health. There's a bit more to it than that, but the simple version is, you take damage, you deal more damage. And your mastery is Critical Block, which increases chance to block and critically block. New in the talent tree is Blood and Thunder, and DPS specs will take this too where AoE is needed of course. This talent spreads your active rend to all targets hit by Thunderclap, so it's a big AoE talent. An alternative strong talent at the top of the protection tree is Insight. This increases the crit chance of Heroic Strike by 5% and makes Heroic Strike crits have a 33% chance to make your next Heroic Strike crit too, but it can't proc off of itself. Shield Mastery is another addition, decreasing the cooldown on all your big shield related abilities by a good margin. And Hold the Line gives you more critical block chance following a parry for 10 seconds. Bastion of Defense makes you crit immune in PvE and gives you an enrage effect too. Vigilance, in addition to its previous effect, will now give you Vengeance stacks as if 20% of the target's damage was dealt to you. This keeps Warrior a bit more relevant when they're not actively tanking. Thunderstruck increases damage of core abilities and stacks up a buff for your next Shockwave, and Heavy Repercussions makes Shield Slam hit double whilst Shield Block is active. Sword and Board increases the crit chance of Devastate and gives that ability and Revenge a chance to make your next Shield Slam reset its cooldown and be free. And finally we have Shockwave, which is pretty much identical to Wrath. It does a bunch of damage to enemies in front of you and stuns them for 4 seconds. Protection warriors would consider prime glyphs such as Devastate, Revenge, and Shield Slam. So then, how are we expecting warriors to stack up in Cataclysm then? Well, the question is really, do you like playing arms? Because you better like playing arms if you're carrying on with your warrior into this expansion, where typically Fury has ended up being top dog for warriors in previous expansions. Cataclysm is going to be arms through and through. In fact, if I'm being honest with how the game is, I'm not sure Fury is better at quite literally anything than arms. It has better mobility, I suppose. For leveling in dungeons, arms is very strong, raiding is arms hands down, and PvP, yeah, arms is the go-to choice. I think Blizzard just gave arms so many incredible tools this expansion that maybe they overdid it a bit. I mean, you get an uncapped sweeping strikes, uncapped blade storm, a 2-minute cooldown that makes your abilities free, tons more baseline damage increases, a mastery which is basically your old sword spec kind of. Arms did really well out of the Rage rework, and I think it will feel as though it's a fast-paced and very strong pick for the whole expansion. Fury on the other hand is expected expected to fall short. You do have the whole Titan's Grip versus single-minded Fury thing going on now, but looking up everything I can online, there's just really not that much information about Fury out there, because people just don't tend to min-max something that isn't seen as a good spec. Also, the age-old conversation between single-minded Fury and Titan's Grip has always been that two-handers just have a ton more stats on them, and often they have more gem sockets too. Main stat is of course a big deal in Cata, and having that extra buffer of stamina is pretty nice too. Single-minded Fury does have the 20% damage buff and slam hitting with both weapons, but I think if it is ever a thing that Titan's Grip will still win out just to raw stats and better availability of weapons. I think Fury is one of the specs in Cata that if Blizzard are feeling the urge to do a bit of meta shifting could be in the crosshairs, because as it is at the moment, outside of I'm just going to try it to see how it does, I don't think this spec will see much representation in the game. And then we have protection, and I am afraid to say I think it's going to be a continuation of how Prot Warrior was in Wrath, which if you are wondering, is not what you want to be hearing. Just to illustrate the point, I've gone and grabbed the last 2 weeks of passes logged for each tank in Wrath, and the volume of Druids and Warriors are about 10% of that of Paladin and DK, and at least for Warrior, I expect this representation to stay pretty similar. So what's the problem with Prot then? Prot is squishy. The bulk of their mitigation is set up around blocking incoming damage, but things do magic damage, and when they do magic damage, your mastery ain't doing all that much of anything. You do have some cooldowns to send off, including Last Stand, Spell Reflect, Shield Block, Shield Wall, but that's kind of it. Your stuns and silences are great in dungeons, but often they just do absolutely nothing in raid, and what we end up with is a tank which can do very respectable damage, it has a bunch of CC, but when it comes to, you know, not taking damage, they kind of forgot to do that bit. All that said, Prot should improve past tier 11 once they get some more gear and mitigation. And skilled players have cleared all content in Wrath with this spec, but heading into Cata with what we know at the moment, I think it's correct to say Protection Warrior will see less play than other tanks. We'll see if Blizzard changes anything here, but that's how I feel on the subject at the moment. Now we have PvP, and guess what? It's going to be all about arms again. Whilst Fury and even Protection can work to a certain degree and sure, play them in Battlegrounds, see how they do, Arms just has more going for it. It has high consistent damage, a mortal strike effect with great uptime, Blade Storm to both escape bad situations and apply pressure, and of course you have Throwdown. Arms already had all of this, and Blizzard went and gave them a 5-second knockdown stun as well, and it's only on a 45-second cooldown, so really warriors can leap onto a new target fast or intervene, get their debuffs rolling, apply a Throwdown, and it's just a lot of pressure out of nowhere. You can even put a few points into Protection to get Gag Order, which causes both Pummel and Heroic Throw to silence for 3 seconds, and it also lowers the cooldown of Heroic Throw to 30 seconds, so warriors even have a decent ranged interrupt now. I wouldn't say Arms is quite on par with how good it's been in Wrath, particularly because you don't have anything like Shadowmourne in Cata, but when it comes to competitive PvP scenarios in Cataclysm, Arms will once again be the spec that people choose more often than not. Now let's check out some tier sets. The Earthen set is from tier 11, so Throne of the Four Winds, Blackwing Descent, Bastion of Twilight. For the DPS 2 set, it increases the damage of Bloodthirst and Mortal Strike by 5%, and the 4 set makes Overpower or Raging Blow give you 1% attack power for 30 seconds, stacking 3 times. Pretty straightforward set, adds a bit of extra damage to your core abilities. Tanks get 5% more damage on Shield Slam for the 2 set, and the 4 set increases the duration of Shield Wall by 50%, so that'll make it into a 40% damage reduction for 18 seconds. Not half bad. Tier 12 is the Molten Giant set from the Firelands. The DPS 2 set makes Battle Shout and Commanding Shout increase damage dealt by 10% for 12 seconds. Remember now, these abilities generate rage and are on a shared 1-minute cooldown, so this is just an on-demand damage buff here and there. The 4 set makes Mortal Strike and Raging Blow have a 30% chance to trigger an extra attack, dealing 100% weapon damage as fire. Pretty nice proc and some good extra passive damage to your rotation. For tanks, the 2 set makes Shield Slam do 20% additional damage as fire, and the 4 set makes it so when Shield Block expires, your parry chances increase by 6% for 10 seconds. So more threat and a small extra damage reduction effect. Finally, we've got tier 13, the Colossal Dragon Plate set from Dragon Soul. For DPS warriors, the 2 set makes Heroic Strike cost 10 less rage when Inner Rage is active. So that will be a 20 rage Heroic Strike with this cooldown up, allowing for some easier management during your burst window. And the 4 set is huge, giving Bloodthirst a 6% chance and Mortal Strike a 13% chance to apply Colossus Smash for 6 seconds. Colossus Smash is of course your big burst window, so getting an extra one for free now and again really pushes warrior performance. Also a side note, in Dragon Soul, you get a weapon called Gerthalak, Voice of the Deeps, which back in the day was a notoriously overpowered weapon due to its proc chance, which would spawn these tentacles that just did so much damage. And for protection, the 2 set makes Revenge grant an absorb for 20% of damage dealt to your main target, and the 4 set makes Shield Wall grant 50% of its effect to all raid members, meaning a raid-wide 20% damage reduction effect, which is of course a huge bonus. And that is the warrior in Cataclysm. To be honest, it really is the arms show through and through this expansion. Whether it's leveling, PvE or PvP, it's just arms which inevitably comes out on top. Blizzard have been more open to making targeted class changes to outliers in Wrath though, and they seem to be continuing with that stance heading on into Cata. But I believe both Prot and Fury could be candidates for changes if they wanted to see more use of them throughout Cata. World of Warcraft's first new class came into the game with a bang in Wrath of the Lich King, originally being without a doubt the most overpowered thing we've ever seen in the game. It could really do anything as any spec, which was, you know, fun for a while, but as they say, no king rules forever. Over the course of Wrath of the Lich King, the Death Knight was toned down and brought more in line with the power level of other classes, but even still they remained a very good DPS and tanking pick. Heading into Cata, we see Blizzard solidify the roles that the DK will be associated in expansions moving forwards, as well as having reworks to core systems such as their runes. As per usual, any race can be a Death Knight, including the 2 new ones in Worgen and Goblin. But with that said, let's begin and check out the Death Knight in Cataclysm. Starting off with our baseline class changes. First up is that, similar to how it's played in Wrath, Blood would now be the go-to tanking spec, and Blood Presence has also been updated to match this playstyle. Unholy would become the master of undead minions wielding a 2-handed weapon. Well, at least we expect them to do so this time. Unholy ended up dual wielding throughout Wrath, strangely enough, but this time around you should be back to your 2-hander. And Frost is the fast-paced DPS which can flex into 2-handed weapons or dual wielding. There is also a pretty big change to how the rune system works as a whole. Now, instead of your runes regenerating as soon as they are spent, they will instead regenerate one after the other. So, say in Wrath at the moment you've spent both of your Frost runes, they will both be regenerating at the same time. This can lead to some awkward scenarios where, as they both come off of cooldown, you don't actually have anything to spend them on if you put other runes out of sync by mistake. If you take the same scenario in Cata, where you've spent both your Frost runes, the first rune spent will start regenerating, and once that is full, the second one will begin doing so. The idea here from Blizzard was to keep resources coming in at a steady pace, rather than sometimes just getting everything at once and you can't spend them fast enough. Runes transformed into death runes, which count for any rune, also follow this system and will regenerate in order relative to the rune they started as. So say if we have a Frost and Unholy rune transformed into death runes, you technically can have 2 death runes coming back up at the same time, but these runes have to fill before the other runes, whether transformed into death or not, will begin regenerating. At first glance, this seems like a straight up nerf to rune regeneration, and the DK will consequently feel much much slower to play, and this just isn't true. There is also a new passive ability called Runic Empowerment in the Frost tree, which gives each spec's main runic power spender a 45% chance to instantly activate a fully depleted rune, including death runes. Also, each spec has a bunch of ways to easily transform a number of their less used runes into death runes too, just to help with your rotation. And a bunch of abilities have had their rune costs changed too to be on the cheaper side. And finally, haste effects will now also improve the speed at which your runes regenerate. So overall, things will feel a bit different on your DK, but hopefully it should feel a bit more of an intuitive and forgiving system compared to how runes worked throughout Wrath. In the Blood tree, this is of course now the established tanking spec. Blood Presence will increase stamina, armor contribution, and reduce damage taken, just all your usual tanking things. Death Strike gets a big buff and is one of the reasons tanking as Blood is so good, as the healing it does will now scale with damage received recently. Disease spread via Pestilence will now only do 50% damage as well. New for Blood is Dark Simulacrum, which places a debuff on the enemy that will allow the DK to copy their next spell. Over in Frost, Frost Presence now increases damage by 10% and runic power generation by 10%. Obliterate no longer consumes diseases by default, and Rune Strike is now an instant ability, not next melee, and it hits a lot harder. New for Frost is Festering Strike, which costs 1 blood and 1 frost. This is an instant attack which extends the duration of Blood Plague, Frost Fever, and Chains of Ice by 6 seconds. And you also get the aforementioned Runic Empowerment, which is when you're landing a damaging Death Coil, Frost Strike, or Rune Strike, there's a 45% chance to activate a random fully depleted rune. And for Unholy Presence now gives you 10% attack speed and rune regeneration rate, 15% move speed, and a 0.5 global cooldown reduction. Death and Decay is now changed to only cost 1 Unholy rune. Raise Ally is a functional combat res now, and not an ability you can just use on someone so they can run around as a ghoul for a bit. New for Unholy is Outbreak on a 1-minute cooldown. This applies Blood, Plague, and Frost Fever to an enemy, which is great for target swapping. You also get Necrotic Strike costing 1 Unholy. This attack places a debuff on an enemy that absorbs healing. Whilst the debuff is active, their cast times are increased by 30%. Mainly a PvP focused talent aimed at annoying healers and casters. Let's start on the talent trees then and see what else we have. When you pick Blood, you get Heart Strike. This now hits the main target harder and cleaves up to 2 nearby enemies up from 1. Veteran of the Third War is a bunch more stamina and expertise and reduces the cooldown on Outbreak by 30 seconds. Bloodright makes it so runes spent on Death Strike and Obliterate will refresh as Death runes. And as standard with all tanks, you get Vengeance, which makes it so when you take damage, you deal more damage, scaling with your max health. And your mastery is Blood Shield. Each time you heal with Death Strike in Blood Presence, you gain 50% of that amount as an absorbed shield. This mastery is really good and is a big reason Blood does so well in Cata. In the talent trees, Bladed Armor is lowered to a 3-point talent and also now increases attack power by 6 per 180 armor that you have. Blood Plague now affects enemies with Scarlet Fever, reducing their physical damage dealt by 10%. This is just a passive talent to give you a demoralizing shout type effect. Bone Shield has been moved over from the Unholy tree, but still has a similar effect, reducing damage taken whilst active by 20%, as well as increasing yours by 2%. Abomination's Might is a flexible talent pick, which can be worked in if your raid needs the attack power buff. Sanguine Fortitude is a huge new talent, which makes Icebound Fortitude free to cast and increases its damage reduction effect from 20% to 50% for 12 seconds. Improved Blood Presence now makes you crit immune in PvE, whilst also increasing rune regeneration rate by 20%. And Will of the Necropolis also sees big buffs. It makes it so when you drop to low health, your rune tap will come off of cooldown and be free to cast, and you reduce all damage taken by 25% for 8 seconds, and this is only on a 45-second internal cooldown. Improved Death Strike is another incredible talent, increasing the damage of Death Strike by 120%, its crit chance by 30%, and its healing by 45%. And finally, Dancing Rune Weapon is made into more of a defensive cooldown. It'll still mirror attacks, but now also gives the DK 20% parry chance while whilst active. Blood considers prime glyphs such as Rune and Heart Strike just for some more damage and threat output, as well as Death and Decay to extend the duration on this ability to make AoE better. When you pick Frost, you get Frost Strike, which is unchanged, just does a bunch of your weapon damage as Frost. You get Icy Talons for 20% attack speed, Blood of the North makes your blood runes into death runes by default, and your mastery is Frozen Heart, which just increases all your frost damage. In the talent tree, Annihilation now increases obliterate damage by 45%, and Brittle Bones is new, allowing the Frost DK to apply a 4% physical damage taken debuff to their targets. Pillar of Frost is a short cooldown ability which increases the Death Knight's strength, as well as providing immunity to knockback effects. Frost DK still of course has Rhyme and Killing Machine for that proc heavy gameplay, where you get abilities to use for free, or the ability to guarantee that they'll crit. Hungering Cold and Chillblains can still situationally be used as CC in PvE encounters where you need to kite mobs around, which does come in Cata actually. And at the bottom of the tree there is a choice between Threat of Thessarian for dual wielding Frost DKs. This makes it so your offhand will also hit with your big attacks. Alternatively, there is Might of the Frozen Waste, which grants 10% bonus damage, as well as causing auto attacks to have a 45% chance to generate 10 runic power. And finally, we have the familiar Howling Blast, which deals high damage to your main target and moderate damage to all nearby targets. The differences in Cata is that it now only costs 1 Frost rune and has no cooldown, so you can really set up a lot of AoE damage on a Frost DK. Frost picks up prime glyphs such as Obliterate and Frost Strike just for some extra damage, as well as Howling Blast so they can passively apply Frost Fever through that spell and not have to worry about pressing Icy Touch. When you pick Unholy, you get Scourge Strike, which is again unchanged from Wrath. It's an instant strike that does extra damage as Shadow depending on how many diseases are on the target. You get Master of Ghouls, which reduces the cooldown on Raised Dead by 60 seconds and turns your ghoul into a pet by default. You get Unholy Might for 25% more strength, and Reaping, so runes spent on Blood Strike, Pestilence or Festering Strike will come back as death runes. And your mastery is Dreadblade, which is just bonus shadow damage. In the talent tree, Morbidity increases the damage of Death Coil by 15%, as well as Death and Decay by 30%. Contagion increases the damage of diseases spread via Pestilence by 100%, which really amps up your AoE. And Unholy Frenzy has moved over from the Blood Tree to now be in Unholy, and will increase melee and ranged haste by 20%, instead of increasing their damage by 20% as it does in Wrath. Runic Corruption reduces the cost of Death Coil by 6, as well as changing Runic Empowerment. It will no longer instantly activate a depleted rune, but will instead increase your rune regeneration by 100% for 3 seconds. Shadow Infusion is new and makes it so when you Death Coil, your ghoul does 6% bonus damage, stacking 5 times. And when this is at 5 stacks, you can use Dark Transformation on your ghoul to turn it into a more powerful undead version for 30 seconds. Whilst transformed, your ghoul's claw becomes a cleave effect, Gnaw stuns for longer and does more damage, Huddle doesn't require to be channeled anymore for the damage reduction, and Leap is now a root and interrupt. So overall, this is just a big upgrade to your minion, whether it's for PvE or PvP. Improved Unholy Presence gives 10% bonus haste, and Sudden Doom has moved over from the Blood Tree, now causing auto attacks to have a chance to make your next Death Coil free to cast. Finally is Ebon Gargoyle, which is in a similar state to Wrath. You summon it in for 30 seconds, and it does nature damage to your main target. So then, how are we expecting the Death Knight to fare in PvE content throughout Cata then? Let's begin with Frost. It should have a strong opening to the expansion and bring competitive DPS on single target, as well as having a good AoE burst profile. It also has some good buff and debuff coverage, bringing 10% physical haste, a 20% attack speed debuff, and a 4% physical damage debuff. There are some other very popular picks such as Survival Hunter and Arms Warrior which can fill most of these niches too, but if you need them, Frost can certainly provide, whilst also doing respectable DPS. Frost also has that benefit of tending to not have a ton of competition when it comes to weapons, as they're going to favour dual wielding one-handed strength weapons. And yes, despite having a talent towards the bottom of the tree which allows you to spec into either dual wielding or two-handed, in PvE at least it is dual wielding which is expected to come out on top, and two-handed tends tends to be more of a PvP focused thing. That being said, up to the launch of Wrath, everyone thought two-handed Unholy was going to be a thing, and it just ended up not being until you got Shadowmourne, I believe. So who knows, maybe we get some surprises here as for which style of Frost does better. Frost itself should be a solid DPS choice and will be playable throughout the expansion, perhaps even being a better DK DPS spec on certain fights. However, similar to how things have been in Wrath, we once again expect Unholy to be the go-to DK DPS spec. With powerful sustained AoE through diseases and death and decay, good single target cooldowns with Dark Transformation, Unholy Frenzy and Summon Gargoyle, and even a decent raid-wide defensive cooldown in anti-magic zone, this spec is an all-rounder that can perform well in any environment. Unholy is also expected to be rocking a two-hander in Kata though, so if that's what you wanted out of your DK, that should now be the case. Unholy should be a solid addition to pretty much any 10 or 25 player raid, and should be a safe main pick for the expansion, which leaves Blood DK. This spec is probably one of the most buff specs in the game, to be honest, and the changes to Death Strike to scale its healing based upon your damage received, and your mastery which give a shield based off how much Death Strike heals, are really what carry you. In fact, Death Strike almost feels like an actual cooldown, but it's not. It's just a button you can press every few globals. And Blood has a lot of cooldowns. Vampiric Blood, Icebound Fortitude, Rune Tap, Blood Tap, Dancing Rune Weapon, Empower Rune Weapon, Bone Shield, Lichborn, Will of the Necropolis, and Anti-Magic Shell. And if you want even more cooldowns, you can also count Death Grip, and why not Strangulation? So yeah, you just never run out of having a button to press, which suits the scenario you're in. A good Blood DK can just give their healers some time off and be fully self-sufficient, to a far greater degree than any other tank can. And your single target threat is better because Rune Strike hits a lot harder, and AoE is just better too because you can glyph Death and Decay to extend its duration, and there's generally just stronger threat modifiers by default in Kata. So believe the Blood DK hype. This will be the main tank to play in the expansion and will be amazing in quite literally every single area of PvE content. Next up, let's do PvP, and again I reckon things are going to be in a somewhat similar state to Wrath. We'll start off with Frost again. For PvP specifically, I think a two-handed build may be a bit more viable because you can't always guarantee 100% uptime on enemies, so when you do connect and you're getting those big hits and crits off, that may count a bit more. Frost brings a strong set of cooldowns including Lichborn to immune Fear, Charm and Sleep effects for 10 seconds, Pillar of Frost for bonus damage and immunity to knockbacks, and of course Hungering Cold. Hungering Cold does get a bit of a nerf in Kata, however. It now has a 1.5 second cast time, whereas in Wrath you could just instantly send it, though you can glyph it now to cost 0 runic power. All the same, it is a long duration CC for how short of a cooldown it's on, and it provides a big window of opportunity to line up burst damage or follow up with more CC. Comps with Frost should be all about that big burst with cooldowns running and looking to catch enemies off guard once they've run through their key cooldowns and trinkets. But the spec I'm expecting to see represented a lot more is going to be Unholy. This spec is all about the consistent pressure of damage over time effects, which wear your opponents down over time. You also get Desecration, Frost can get this too of course, and that just puts slow fields all over the place, making it so your enemies have a much harder time getting around. You of course have your permanent ghoul pet, which adds another layer of complexity and skill to the class. And you can also empower your pet too through Dark Transformation to both give it an improved stun as well as another interrupt, so it's important you get the most out of it. Of course, Unholy packs both strong physical and magical damage mitigation and good burst with Unholy Frenzy and Summon Gargoyle. Its only real weakness is its lack of mobility, but that's going to be a trend with DK for many expansions to come. Expect to see Unholy DKs pair up with damage over time heavy comps that want to win the war of attrition. Next up, let's check out DK's tier sets. Tier 11 is the Magma Plated set. For DPS, the 2 set adds 5% crit chance to Death Coil and Frost Strike, and the 4 set makes it so each time you gain a Death Rune or trigger Killing Machine, you gain 1% attack power, stacking 3 times. Pretty straightforward DPS set to just passively increase your damage damage. For tanks you get 5% more damage on Death Strike for the 2 set, and the 4 set increases the duration of Icebound Fortitude by 50%, so it will now last 18 seconds. Following that we have tier 12, the Elementium Death Plate set from the Firelands. On the 2 set, Horn of Winter will now grant 3 runic power every 5 seconds for 2 minutes, just a passive addition to your runic power generation. And on your 4 set, Obliterate and Scourge Strike will deal 6% bonus damage as fire. Blood DK gets an interesting 2 set. Your melee attacks cause burning blood on the target, which deals 800 damage every 2 seconds for 6 seconds, and causes your abilities to act as if you had 2 diseases on your target. The 4 set makes it so when Dancing Rune Weapon fades, you gain a bunch of extra parry for 12 seconds, so just even more mitigation. And last but not least is tier 13, the Necrotic Boneplate set from Dragon Soul. The DPS 2 set makes Sudden Doom have a 30% chance and Rhyme a 60% chance to grant 2 charges instead of 1 when they proc. This should keep your resources flowing and your rotation just feeling that much better. And the 4 set makes Runic Empowerment have a 25% chance and Runic Corruption a 40% chance to also grant 710 mastery for 12 seconds when activated, and each of their masteries will just improve the damage for frost or shadow attacks respectively. And for blood, the 2 set makes it so when you drop below 35% health, one of your blood runes will immediately activate and turn into a death rune. This should pretty much guarantee you can press Death Strike, and if your health has dropped to the point where this will activate, you can assume your Death Strike is going to do a good amount of healing. And finally, your 4 set makes Vampiric Blood also affect all party and raid members for 50% of its base effect. So that'll be 7.5% max health and 12.5% healing received for 10 seconds. And this is only on a 1-minute cooldown as well, so as per usual with the tier 13 tank set bonuses, pretty insane. And that is the Death Knight in Cataclysm. It's a really well-rounded class, and if you've been a DK enjoyer throughout Wrath, believe me, it's worth a try. The big change has to be to the rune system, but I think when you've got used to playing it a bit, it'll make sense. DPS wise, I reckon Unholy will more often than not come out on top, but Frost will have its time to shine as well. And as for blood and tanking, it's probably not just only the best overall tank of the expansion, but is also the most fun due to how powerful it feels to have so much control over your health. Whilst other tanks are often sitting there waiting for a heal to land, the blood DK can be in so much more control because of how many cooldowns they have. Every class goes through a good amount of changes when we get to an expansion, but few so much as the Hunter. With a complete resource overhaul, new playstyles, more utility, and even pet changes, there's going to be a bunch to know about the Hunter in Cataclysm. Though, as much as it is different, it's also quite familiar to how it's played throughout Wrath. Both new races in Worgen and Goblin have access to the Hunter class, as do Human and Undead, so plenty of choice in your preferred pick here. But we've got a bunch to get through, so let's get stuck in and take a look at Hunter changes in Cataclysm Classic. First up, what is new baseline to the class? Well, say goodbye to your mana bar first of all. Similar to what your pet has been using for the past few years, the Hunter will now also have Focus as their primary resource. Focus works very much like an energy bar, where it will restore over time, is increased by haste effects, and can also be gained through talents as well as procs. The difference is Hunters have a much more active role in maintaining their focus through steady or Cobra Shot. This does also change Hunters from just pressing an ability when it comes off of cooldown to now making sure that you have enough focus for the appropriate ability, be it on single target or on AoE. You know, in pre-release vanilla, Blizzard nearly gave Hunters focus from day one, but it would have only regenerated when you were standing still, so I think this version is a bit better than that. Either way, mana has had its time, but especially playing Survival in Wrath of the Lich King, honestly, most of the time you didn't really notice it was there anyway. Another change is that Hunters will no longer use ammo either, so +1 bag space for the Hunters. Pet Happiness is also gone from the game, so your pet is always going to be doing the same damage. All effects that used to modify Pet Happiness will now just restore health. Something new, which you'll be happy to hear about, is that auto shots will now fire off whilst moving, so you don't have to do that thing where you pause for a moment anymore. I bet it's going to take Hunter mains a little while to adjust to this one. In fact, Hunter as a whole is going to be an incredibly mobile DPS this expansion, which is another way of saying you get to deal with lots of ranged mechanics, so do be aware of that too. Not everything has gone though. Minimum attack range for ranged weapons is still in the game, and melee players will be delighted to know that Hunters will still want to roll on melee weapons as stat sticks. Both of these things ended up changing in Mists of Pandaria, but we're not quite there yet. Hunter pets get more options too. The aggressive stance is gone and has been replaced by assist, which just makes your pet hit what you are hitting. Also, the stay command is gone and has been replaced by move 2, so you can pre-position your pet if needs be. You also get a bunch of new pets in Cataclysm, from foxes, beetles, monkeys, mastiffs, to exotic pets such as the Shale's spider. And these pets have so many new abilities too. Most of them are just focus dumps which fit thematically with their pet type, but hunters are also like a toolbox of different raid-wide buffs or debuffs. Chances are if your raid is missing something, there is a hunter pet that will be able to do it. Your pet talent trees are still in the game too, and are relatively unchanged from Wrath, but I'll talk more about that when we get onto talents. Over in the Beast Mastery tree, Kill Command has been reworked. Now it's kind of similar to how it was in TBC again, where it's an instant attack with a short cooldown, and it's going to be the most important focus dump for BM hunters nowadays. Call Stabled Pet has been changed up too. Now you can call a variety of 5 different pets instead of having to wait 5 minutes between each time you wanted to swap a pet out. This is kind of a big deal in PvP. Mend Pet now restores 25% of your pet's max health instead of a flat amount, and Feed Pet restores 50% health and is only usable out of combat. A new ability in the BM tree, which I kind of completely forgot about until doing the video, is called Widow Venom, which is just a 25% healing debuff, or in other words, your standard Mortal Strike effect in Cataclysm. Guessing this is more of a PvP thing since Aim Shot no longer has a Mortal Strike effect. You also get Aspect of the Fox. This is the thing that makes Hunter super mobile. Your steady or Cobra shots can now be used whilst moving, and you also gain focus when hit by melee attacks. In the Marksmanship tree, Volley is gone, and Multi-Shot has been changed to be your big filler AoE ability. Multi-Shot itself now has a focus cost, no cooldown, and is no longer target capped. Steady Shot generates some focus in addition to dealing damage now, and Flare will reveal both hidden and invisible enemies. Arcane Shot is based off of weapon damage, so it actually does some damage, which is nice, and usually I wouldn't specifically mention glyphs here, but there's a glyph for Kill Shot, where if it doesn't kill its target, its cooldown is instantly reset and you can use it again. So when you're in execute phase, you more or less always have 2 kill shots, which is just a lot of fun. In the survival tree, we have quite a few changes. Scatter Shot is now a baseline ability for hunters and does not need to be talented. Deterrence, in addition to deflecting attacks, will now also reduce all damage taken by 30% for its duration. New things in the survival tree include Trap Launcher. Activate to fire your next trap from range. You can use it on any trap, but it does cost a bit of focus to use. Cobra Shot is an ability I've mentioned once or twice now, and it's an alternative to Steady Shot, which deals nature damage and extends the duration of Serpent Sting. This is your go-to filler spell as Beast Mastery or Survival. Camouflage is a new and rather strange ability. 1 minute cooldown lasts 1 minute, activate to become untargetable by ranged attacks, and also be stealthed when stationary. You can also drop traps during camo, but damage will remove the effect. Next up, we're going to check out some of the new talents and builds related to PvE. Here I'll be going over Beast Mastery and Survival, and we'll get on to Marksmanship a little bit later. When you choose the BM tree, you get Intimidation, which works the same way that it basically always has. Your pet gets a stun and generates some threat. You'll also get Animal Handler for 30% bonus attack power, and your mastery increases the damage done by your pets. The talent tree for BM has been given a pretty severe shake-up in terms of which talents are where and what they do, and for good reason, because BM in Wrath of the Lich King was at best really just a leveling spec. New is Focus Fire. This consumes up to 5 stacks of your pet frenzy for 3% haste per stack, so you're capping out at 15% haste, and you should be able to maintain this all the time. Cobra Strikes has been changed to a flat that 15% proc chance when you use Arcane Shot, and will make your pet's next 2 special attacks crit. Further is a new instant cooldown which restores a bunch of focus, and Killing Streak makes it so when kill command crits twice in a row, the next one does more damage and costs less focus. Bestial Wrath has been toned down. It used to deal 50% bonus damage, but now it's 20% in Cata. Then again, we do have a pet mastery now to offset this big nerf. The Beast Within also reduces the focus cost of abilities by 50% whilst Bestial Wrath is active, making it into a much better cooldown. BM also, of course, brings that 3% damage buff to your raid from Ferocious Inspiration, which otherwise still only Ret or Arcane can do, so this can be pretty nice to have. Invigoration gets a big buff. When your pet crits, you instantly get 6 focus. And finally, Beast Mastery allows you to tame certain exotic pets with unique abilities and increases the number of pet talent points you have by 4. Your choice of pet in Cata comes down to what the raid needs in terms of buffs or debuffs that may be missing. If nothing's missing, then more or less any pets with the Ferocity talent tree will do just fine. So expect to see a bit more variety in pets used during Cata. Also, exotic pets have 2 unique abilities instead of the one that other pets will do. For example, Chimera have a Frost Breath attack as a ranged focus spender, as well as Frost Storm Breath, which is an AoE channeled attack. In terms of your Ferocity pet talents, it's pretty similar to Wrath. What we're looking at picking up here is Culling the Herd, so you and your pet have a 3% damage buff, Rabid as a self buff for your pet, and of course Call of the Wild. This is a 10% attack power buff that should be macroed together with other big cooldowns. Wild Hunt has also been reworked from bonus stats to your pet now spends more focus on attacks, but they do way more damage. However, realistically, only BM will be able to get this due to their extra talent points. BM uses glyphs such as Arcane Shot, Kill Command, and Kill Shot. But the vast majority of the time, it won't be BM that you are seeing in PvE. It's gonna be survival. It's kinda looking like a run back from Wrath of the Lich King here, where the go-to spec of the expansion was survival from day 1 right to the very end. Either way, in the last few patches of Cata, survival got a few very good buffs in a row, leaving it in a very strong place. When you pick the survival talent tree, you gain the iconic explosive shot. Still works the way it always has, but it now costs 50 focus. Bit of a side note, spell ranks are gone in Cata by the way, so you won't be doing any 4-3-4 macroing anymore if you did that in Wrath, and will have to properly space out your explosive shot casts when lock and load is active. You gain 10% bonus agility to a survival, and your mastery increases all magical damage you deal. In your talent tree, a very important pickup is improved Serpent Sting. This is going to make Serpent Sting start to deal some real good damage. Lock and Load and TNT now provide different ways to proc 2 free casts of explosive shot. The former from Frost Traps, the latter from Fire Damage or Black Arrow. Toxicology is new and increases the periodic crit damage of Serpent Sting and Black Arrow by 100%, and Noxious Stings increases damage against targets with Serpent Sting active by 10%. Hunting Party is changed to be an aura-wide attack power buff if your raid doesn't already have that. Towards the bottom of the tree is Serpent Spread. Targets hit by multi-shot are now afflicted by 6 seconds of Serpent Sting. This scales super well with the instant damage from improved Serpent Sting, and along with Explosive Trap, keeps Hunter doing some great AoE damage. And finally is Black Arrow, which is simply a damage over time effect. And you're probably wondering this as well if you've played Hunter in Wrath, and yes, you will be casting Black Arrow on single target. Glyph of Explosive Trap is gone too, as all periodic effects can crit by default in Cata, and they buffed Black Arrow to deal way more damage and tick more often as well in later patches of the expansion, so it should be your go-to single target ability instead of having to worry about finding angles to launch Explosive Trap. Survival uses glyphs such as Explosive Shot, Kill Shot, and Arcane Shot or Serpent Sting depending on the tier. So how are we expecting the Hunter to perform overall in PvE then? Well, you might have noticed I just straight up didn't cover marksmanship in the PvE section, and unfortunately that has happened for a reason. If you go and look back at Fireland's Rag 25 Heroic World First, Paragon were playing marksmanship back then during this fight, so there must have been a time when it was the go-to new hunter spec for the expansion, but everything I can find these days points to marksmanship being sent into the shadow realm in terms of PvE viability. It's a spec that doesn't bring much in the way of buffs or debuffs that another class or hunter spec can't, and most of all, it just doesn't put up enough damage. This may very well be a repeat of the Wrath of the Lich King marksman hunter, but we don't have the light at the end of the tunnel that maybe it would have scaled with armor pen, and even then in Wrath, marksman got destroyed by survival when more than one target existed. But marksmanship is not looking as though it's going to be a viable pick for PvE in Cataclysm at this point in time. It's expected that BM will be playable to a certain degree and can provide good single target damage as well as buff coverage, but it's otherwise very lacking on the AoE side of things. The fact that BM has the 3% damage buff though and can bring nearly any raid-wide buff are really the reasons to play it. But if everything is covered, you're gonna be playing survival. So survival itself has top tier single target damage and the best AoE of any hunter spec by a very, very long way. It even specs into making its utility traps better by default, and its playstyle is also pretty similar to Wrath, to be honest. Apply your dots, keep explosive shot on cooldown, and just blast on DPS. Of course, hunters also bring misdirection, which is an amazing cooldown to get mobs to tanks, and they're just far more mobile in Cata thanks to Aspect of the Fox. Survival is expected to be a top tier pick at the start of the expansion, but should be outscaled as we progress by other classes, particularly those who get access to a legendary, so casters with the two-handed staff or rogues with daggers. Either way, if you liked survival in Wrath, you're gonna like it in Cata, and it remains something that's always wanted in a raid. Next we have PvP, and in this bit I want to focus on marksman. So when you pick the marksmanship tree, you get aim shot. Aim shot is now once again a casted ability that deals high single target damage. You also get bonuses to your auto shot damage, and your mastery gives ranged attacks a chance to instantly fire an additional shot. Improved steady shot is a core ability which gives you 15% ranged attack speed for 8 seconds after using 2 steady shots in a row. Careful aim gives 60% bonus crit chance to a few shots on targets above 90% health. This is a huge talent for target swapping or opening on somebody coming out of CC. Silencing shot is of course still in the game and has been moved a bit further up the marksman tree. Concussive Barrage now guarantees a daze effect when Chimera or multi-shot lands, and True Shot Aura has had a mini rework. Now it increases the melee attack power of allies by 20% and ranged attack power by 10%. This buff is also brought by a number of other classes though. Termination gives steady shot more focus generation when used on low health targets, and Master Marksman has also been reworked. When using steady shot, you have a 60% chance to gain a stack of Master Marksman, and at 5 stacks your next aim shot is free and instant cast. Marked for Death makes certain hunter abilities passively apply a version of Hunter's Mark. Post Haste reduces the cooldown on rapid fire and gives 30% movement speed after using disengage for a short period. Finally, we have Chimera Shot, which now in Cata refreshes Serpent Sting and gives you a minor heal. Marksman will use glyphs such as Arcane Shot, Steady Shot and Rapid Fire. In PvP you will also be using a different pet, and most of the time you're gonna be seeing the Monkey. It's a cunning pet, and in the talent tree the big selling points are Bullheaded, which is a PvP trinket for your pet, Roar of Recovery to regenerate some of the hunter's focus, and Roar of Sacrifice, which makes the target immune to crits on a 1-minute cooldown, but transfers 20% of damage taken to the hunter's pet. The reason you take Monkey often is for Bad Mana, which is their unique ability. This is essentially blind, but it lasts 4 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. This is very good for setting up CC chains. I'm pretty sure there was a bug where you could chain call stabled pets with 5 monkeys and use Bad Mana 5 times in a row, which had no diminishing returns for a 20-second CC. I'm guessing this got changed at some point, but anyway, monkeys are going to be great for PvP. Next up we have our tier set, starting with tier 11 from Bastion of Twilight, Throne of the Four Winds and Blackwing Descent. This set has always kind of looked like a weird Murloc to me. I think it's the helm that does it. Maybe that's what Blizzard were going for though. Either way, the 2 set increases crit chance of Serpent Sting by 5%, which Survival definitely benefits the most from, and the 4 set reduces the cast time of Steady or Cobra Shot by 0.2 seconds. Overall, just a bunch more focus generation and damage from this tier. Not the most exciting bonuses, but very functional. Tier 12 is the Flame Walker's battle gear from the Firelands. I like what they did with this tier set, it's very fitting for the raid, and the helm makes you look like one of the bosses, Shanox, who is found in the Firelands. The 2 set makes it so Steady or Cobra Shot have a 10% chance to trigger a flaming arrow for 80% weapon damage as fire. Again, sounds great for survival because they do bonus magic damage. And the 4 set gives your auto shots a 10% chance to make your next shot or kill command free. Pretty huge 4 set bonus here. This will be saving you a ton of focus over the course of a fight, particularly when you have cooldowns running. Finally, from Dragon Soul is tier 13, the Wormstalker's battle gear. The set bonuses are kind of insane though, which is very typical for Dragon Soul tier. The 2 set straight up doubles the focus gain from Steady or Cobra Shot, and the 4 set gives Arcane Shot a chance to grant 30% bonus haste for 15 seconds. That is another heroism effect on your tier, which is pretty amazing. For what it's worth, all Hunter specs do use Arcane Shot as a focus dump, but it might be kind of annoying to get this to proc when you want it to. However, I checked it out and Wowhead says it has a 105-second internal cooldown and a 40% proc chance. So this will just be one to track with weak auras and making sure when it's off of cooldown, you have some Arcane Shots to fire off. And that is your Hunter class in Cataclysm. Though it is set to get some pretty big changes, I do think the way it plays remains quite familiar, and if you've liked playing your Hunter in Wrath, you're probably gonna like it in Cata as well. It remains a very strong pick in PvP, having a number of comps which can very much push rating, and in PvE, Survival is looking as though it will be a mainstay pick which will be highly valued throughout the entire expansion. Earth, Wind, Water and Fire. The Shaman is World of Warcraft's master of the elements, being able to DPS from afar as a caster, get stuck into the fray as melee, or even heal allies as restoration. With the whole expansion being centered around elemental turmoil, you'd hope the Shaman would shape up pretty well, and you'd be right. You also get a few more choices for your Shaman too, as Goblin can become Shaman for the Horde, as well as Dwarves on the Alliance. But with 3 specs to cover and a bunch of changes to go over, let's talk Shaman in Cataclysm. So first up, as always, our baseline changes, and we will begin with Elemental. Fire Nova now originates from targets affected by your Flame Shock instead of your Totem, and its cooldown is lowered from 10 seconds to 4. And Purge will remove 1 magical debuff now on enemies instead of 2. Bind Elemental is new and is a single target hard CC effect against an elemental enemy, with damage breaking the effect. You also get Spirit Walker's Grace, allowing you to cast spells whilst moving, and it can be casted while you're already mid-spell. This has a 15-second duration and a 2-minute cooldown. Also, Lightning Bolt gets a new animation in Cataclysm. For enhancement, Flame Tongue Weapon now increases magical damage done by 5%. Flame Tongue Totem will increase party and raid spell damage by 6%. Wind Fury Totem will now increase melee and ranged haste by 10%. Wind Fury Weapon now causes 3 extra attacks with bonus attack power, and Rock Biter increases threat by 30% and reduces damage taken by 5%. New for enhancement is Primal Strike. This is just a button you press before you get hold of Storm Strike. Elemental Resistance Totem is new as well, which is just all of your resist totems combined together. And you have Unleash Elements, which empowers your next ability depending on your weapon imbue. If you have Flame Tongue, your next fire spell will deal 20% more damage. Frostbrand will slow the target by 50%. Wind Fury increases attack speed by 40% for your next 6 melee swings. Rockbiter will taunt for 5 seconds, and Earth Living will increase the effectiveness of your next direct heal by 20%. For restoration, Tremor Totem now works raid-wide, and you can use it whilst under effects, which it can remove. There is of course the general healing rework. Healing Surge fills that role at a less Lesser Healing Wave used to, in that it's fast but it costs a lot. Greater Healing Wave is your big, slow, efficient heal, and Healing Wave is now your slow, efficient, moderate heal. Your ability to remove poisons and diseases as a Shaman is gone in Kata. This includes Cleansing Totem and Cleanse Spirit, and Cleanse Spirit itself in Kata will now only remove curses. New to Restoration is Totem of the Tranquil Mind, which causes allies to lose 30% less casting or channeling time, and Healing Rain, which places down a healing field in a zone, restoring health to allies inside every 2 seconds for 10 seconds. So let's check out some talent trees now and see what we have. When you pick Elemental, you get Thunderstorm, which is the same as it is in Wrath really. It knocks people back, it does some damage, but now it also has a 40% slow added onto it as well. Shamanism gives you some scaling on your big spells, and reduces their cast time by half a second. Elemental Fury gives you 100% bonus crit damage, and removes the cooldown of Chain Lightning. And your mastery is Elemental Overload, which now also includes Lava Burst. It's very similar to the talent of the same name, but it's just something you can actively scale with your gear now. In the talent tree, Reverberation can now lower the cooldown of Wind Shear by up to 10 seconds, putting it down to a 5-second cooldown, making it the lowest interrupt cooldown in the game. Elemental Precision increases all damage and makes Spirit also count as hit, and something you can treat as an interchangeable stat if you do end up rolling something with Spirit. Rolling Thunder restores some mana and causes your Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning to have a chance to add an extra stack onto your Lightning Shield up to a cap of 9. And the talent just below it, Fulmination, will cause Earthshock to consume these excess Lightning Shield charges to instantly deal damage. Elemental Mastery gets a nice buff. It still makes one of your spells instant, but now it gives 15% damage and 20% spell haste for 15 seconds as well. And Feedback is new, causing Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning to reduce the remaining cooldown on Elemental Mastery by 3 seconds. You get Lava Surge 2 that gives Flame Shock ticks a chance to reset the cooldown on Lava Burst. And at the bottom of the tree is Earthquake. This is a casted ability which causes damage at its location with a chance to knock down enemies inside. And it's in a bit of a strange spot in Kata. So early on in the expansion, Earthquake was actually a channeled ability, and the problem was back then was, well, it just didn't do much damage. Also, it cost a ton of mana, so that was no good. In patch 4.1, Blizzard buffed it to now be a casted ability instead, and in 4.3 they even buffed its damage by 75%, and it's still just not very good and doesn't do much damage unfortunately. There will be elemental builds out there which say straight up, do not take this talent, and they would be right to do so. Even in the ideal scenario where you can precast an Earthquake on a place where ads will be moved to, they'll stay in there for the full duration, and they'll be affected by the knockdown, it's still just kind of average. If Blizzard are considering much in the way of rebalancing stuff during Kata, maybe this talent should be something they think about. Elemental uses glyphs such as Flame Shock, so you just have to refresh it a bit less, Lava Burst for some more big damage, but most importantly, Unleashed Lightning, which allows you to cast a Lightning Bolt whilst moving. This is an absolute gameplay changer of a glyph, and is probably one of the most fun things about this spec in Kata. When you pick Enhancement, you get access to Lava Lash, which is really just unchanged. You can also dual wield, have a bonus 6% hit chance, and you can parry as well. Mental Quickness will give you 55% of your attack power as spell power, and you can no longer benefit from other sources of spell power, rip Spell Hance. Also, instant spells and totems cost 75% less mana. You get Primal Wisdom, which just aims to keep your mana bar healthy, and your mastery is Enhanced Elements, increasing all fire, frost, and nature damage. In the tree, we have the new Focus Strikes, which increases damage of both Primal Strike and Storm Strike by 45%. Elemental Weapons is something that every spec will look to pick up, both buffing the passive effect of your weapon imbues, as well as making Unleashed Elements that much bit better. Ancestral Swiftness makes both Ghost Wolf instant and increases your movement speed by 15% passively. Having an instant Ghost Wolf is just a really nice move speed tool, which I would struggle to play Shaman without, so I'd always pick this up. The debuff from Storm Strike now causes your nature damage spells to have a bonus 25% crit chance versus the target, and Shamanistic Rage now causes all non-healing abilities to be free for its duration, in addition to the previous damage reduction effect. Searing Flames causes that totem to stack up a debuff on its target up to 5 times, and Improved Lava Lash will consume these stacks for bonus damage, and will also cause your Flame Shock to spread to 4 nearby targets. Maelstrom weapon is very similar to Wrath. It causes your attacks to have a chance to grant a stack of Maelstrom, and at 5 stacks a number of your casted spells are both free and instant. And at last we have Feral Spirit, which is now a 30-second duration ability with a 2-minute cooldown. And what they do is very similar to Wrath, so they'll have a 2-second stun, a Blessing of Freedom type effect with a 60% move speed increase as well, a gap closer, an AoE taunt, and they'll heal for the damage dealt. So really they just do a bit of everything. Enhancement takes some pretty straightforward damage increasing prime glyphs such as Lava Lash, Storm Strike, and Wind Fury weapon. Next we have Restoration. When you pick this talent tree, you get Earth Shield, which is unchanged. You put it on your main target. When they take damage, they heal a bit. You get Purification, which is a 25% bonus to healing spells, and a 0.5 second cast time reduction on Healing Wave and Greater Healing Wave. Meditation allows 50% of mana regen from Spirit to continue in combat, and your Mastery is Deep Healing, which increases your healing done depending on your target's missing health. Ancestral Resolve can reduce damage taken while casting by up to 10%. Very nice passive mitigation bonus for both Elemental and Restoration here. Spark of Life increases healing done by 6% and received by 15%, and Totemic Focus increases the duration of totems by 40%, as well as reducing their mana cost. This is a big talent for Restoration that has several cooldown based totems which really benefit from the longer duration. Nature's Blessing increases the effectiveness of your direct heals on earth shielded targets, and Soothing Rains improves the effect of both Healing Stream Totem and Healing Rain. Mana Tide Totem has a bit of a rework and will increase your party and raid member spirit by 200% of the Shamans. This turns Mana Tide Totem into a tool that regenerates mana for pretty much just the healers, instead of giving your party a percentage of their mana back. Telluric Currents is an interesting addition, causing a lightning bolt to regenerate mana equal to 40% of its damage. You pick up this talent and there's never a reason for downtime anymore on your Restoration Shaman. There'll always be a button to press. And Spirit Link Totem is your big new raid-wide cooldown. Players inside will take 10% less damage, and every second all players will have their health equalized such that everyone has the same percentage max health. This stacks up great with the Shaman's other heals, which generally do want players to be stacked, such as Healing Rain or Chain Heal. Tidal Waves work similar to Wrath in that it reduces the cast time of your slow heals and the crit chance of your fast one. And finally we have Riptide, which again, just like Wrath of the Lich King, it does a bunch of instant damage and then a heal over time effect, and it can be consumed by Chain Heal to improve that spell's effect. Resto considers prime glyphs such as Earth Shield and Earth Living Weapon for more healing, and Riptide to increase the duration of it. So how are we expecting Shamans to perform overall in PvE this expansion then? Well, I reckon the spec you're going to be seeing the most of, for a change, will be Elemental. With Lightning Bolt on the move, powerful cooldowns such as Fire Elemental and Elemental Mastery, and Overload now becoming their Mastery and benefiting Lava Burst, this spec stands to gain a lot of damage. You bring a good set of utility through totems and your talent tree passives, and of course a Heroism or Bloodlust type effect if you don't have a mage in the group. Elemental's also pretty straightforward to play and get good results from. You just don't waste your Fulmination stacks, keep Flame Shock up, press Lava Burst whenever you can, keep your totems up, and then just press Lightning Bolt. And for AoE, Chain Lightning gets its cooldown removed too, so it becomes way more powerful. What is a bit of a shame with Kata being how it usually is that I don't think Earthquake is going to see much play. It feels undertuned damage wise, and I'm assuming that this is the case because of the CC effect that it has on top of it. If you were topping damage meters whilst also spamming a knockdown effect on mobs, that would be kinda crazy. Blizzard has been more open to making class changes throughout Wrath though, and I'm not sure there is a single other spec in the game which really doesn't care about their capstone talent in many scenarios. Then again, saying that, Elemental is already going to do great in PvE, and a buff to Earthquake is a buff to Elemental. Maybe if it was just cheaper and took less time to cast, it would be enough to make it work. Either way, we'll see what Blizzard end up doing here. Next most popular, I think, will be Restoration Shaman, particularly in 25 player raids where their toolkit is really good. Both Mana Tide Totem and Spirit Link stack up better when there are just more people in the raid as a whole. Mana Tide because in 25 there's more healers to benefit from it, and Spirit Link Totem because there's just more health bars to regen distribute. Restoration also gains powerful AoE healing through Healing Rain, and Unleash Life into a direct heal can provide some very mana efficient throughput. Shaman's Mastery Deep Healing can also scale super well on fights where there's just a bunch of damage going out, because the lower people's health bars are, the more powerful the Resto Shaman gets. An Unleash Life Greater Healing Wave crit on a low health target can take them from death's door to near enough full health, and with how healing works in Cata, not everyone can do that anymore. I don't think Resto Shaman will be quite as popular in 10-player raidy environments, where it tends to be the case that you take Disc Priest and then Holy Pala or Resto Druid, but I'm sure people will find a way to make it work, and if you're sticking to normal, they'll be just fine. Finally, I reckon the Shaman spec we'll be seeing the least of this expansion will be enhancement. The big thing that enhancements typically brought for is their buffs, mainly through totems. Their big bonuses in Wrath were an attack power buff, which can now be brought by popular classes such as any Paladin or a Blood DK, melee haste, which is now melee and ranged haste in Cata. This can be done by a Survival Hunter or a Frost DK, and of course Heroism or Bloodlust, the most powerful cooldown ever, which can now also be done by a Mage. Now maybe you're a 10-player raid and you don't have all these class buffs and enhancement fills the niche really well, but I'm just gonna say in 25, more often than not, you're gonna have these all covered, which puts enhancement in a spot where they need to do damage to compete, and whilst they are fine enough in this regard, you'll often find other specs beat them out. I've no doubt a skilled player will make enhancement work, but the argument has always been a skilled player will make an average class good and a good class great. So why just settle for good? Enhancement seems fine as a whole though, and if you do have one in your raid, I do expect it to be one, and guilds may not recruit them as much as other classes and specs, but those are just my impressions I get on it heading into Cata at this early stage. Next up is PvP. For Elemental there's a few key talents here that need picking up, such as Lava Flows, which gives you a crazy 90% spell haste when Flame Shock is dispelled for 6 seconds. You'll also want Earth's Grasp to cause Earthbind to root targets when you use it, as well as going into enhancement of course to get that instant cast Ghost Wolf, which is just too good not to have. Elemental will have a pretty similar playstyle to Wrath too, in that they'll have a bunch of off heals, utility and burst, but they also do lose out as well. With bigger health bars overall, your Lava Burst, even when it overloads, isn't going to be as scary as it is in Wrath. And Elemental also loses out on a big passive damage mitigation tool in Astral Plane, which used to reduce damage taken when stun, feared or silenced by 30% passively. It's just gone now, there's nothing to replace it. Also, if we think Earthquake is unusable in PvE, it's incredibly unusable in PvP. Are you going to have a few seconds to stand there and waste tons of mana on something that barely does any damage? No, that's just not going to happen. To add to the list of downgrades, you also can't use Heroism or Bloodlust in Arena in Cata anymore, so one of the Shaman's biggest selling points is just gone. Elemental is still good in larger scale PvP, such as rated battlegrounds, where you have more breathing room to sit back and cast, but for Arena specifically, I think you're going to have a harder time getting good results on this spec compared to how it was in Wrath. And I'm going to have to say more or less the same for enhancement here. It does get some interesting new talents such as Frozen Power, which encourages you to use Frostbrand Weapon for quite possibly the first time ever in Classic's history, and Frost Shock will root targets which are more than 15 yards away from you. You also get Earthen Power, which causes Earthbind to remove slows as well, but the spec just feels as though it's missing something. It doesn't have a Mortal Strike effect, it's got very few CC buttons, Feral Spirit can stun but that's on a 2-minute cooldown, and you don't really have that many defensives either once Shamanistic Rage is done. I mean, it is only on a 1-minute cooldown, but that's kind of your main thing. As always though, it's partially down to preference and what you feel you'll get the best results with. But for Cata, I do think it's right to say enhancement will on average have a more difficult time climbing the ladder than some other specs. Which leaves us with Restoration Shaman, and thankfully I get to say some positive things here now, because I think Resto Shaman is the most improved PvP healer from Wrath moving into Cata. I've mentioned it before, but the Deep Healing Mastery can just get so much value in PvP, and though you can't remove poisons or diseases anymore, you can still get rid of curses, and you get a defensive magic dispel in your talent tree. You also still have Purge, so you can now remove magic debuffs offensively and defensively defensively. This is kind of a big deal, and for the first time ever, a class other than Priest can do this. The bigger health bars in Kata also really benefit the Shaman's big new cooldown in Spirit Link Totem, and you also benefit from the healing rework a lot thanks to tidal waves constantly empowering your casted abilities. Don't forget you still have things such as Earthbind, Grounding, Wind Shear, and all these other great tools. Back in the day, I remember a lot of really strong comps having the foundation of Resto Shaman and Warlock, and then usually a Rogue or something like that. We'll see what ends up being popular these days though, but I think Resto Shaman, if you're interested in PvP, is going to be a great pick. Let's check out some tier sets. So first up we have tier 11, the Raging Elements set. For healers, the 2 set gives 5% bonus crit chance on Healing Wave, and the 4 set gives 540 spirit for 6 seconds after having casted Riptide. Restoration, of course, scales great with crit thanks to their mastery as well as ancestral healing and awakening, so this is great. And more spirit is just a bit more mana regen. For enhancement, the 2 set increases the damage of Storm Strike and Lava Lash by 10%, and the 4 set adds 10% crit chance to Lightning Bolt. A bit more damage on your rotation passively, and with the new Storm Strike debuff, your Lightning Bolt will have a baseline 35% crit chance, so not bad. And Elemental gets 10% bonus crit chance to Flame Shock on their 2 set, as well as reducing the cast time of Lightning Bolt on their 4 set. Following that, we'll have tier 12, the Erupting Volcanic set from the Firelands. For Resto, the 2 set gives periodic healing from Riptide, a 40% chance to restore 1% of your base mana when it ticks. This should be around 235 mana restored, which sounds very strong actually. With Glyph of Riptide, the hot's base duration will be 21 seconds, and it's only on a 6-second cooldown. The 4 set makes this even better as Chain Heal will no longer consume Riptide on your main target. This seems like a great set for Resto Shaman. The enhancement 2 set makes it so Lava Lash gains an additional 5% bonus damage from the Searing Flames talent, moving its bonus damage from 10% per stack to 15%. And the 4 set makes Storm Strike cause its target to essentially take 6% more damage from all your fire spells. Again, this seems like another good set. And for Elemental, it's amazing too. On the 2 set, Lightning Bolt has a 30% chance to reduce the remaining cooldown on your Fire Elemental totem by 4 seconds, and the 4 set makes it so when Lava Surge procs, your next Lava Burst is instant cast as well. This should really smooth out your gameplay and allow you to fire off your big cooldown that bit more often. Last, we have tier 13, the Spirit Walker set from Dragon Soul. For Resto, the 2 set makes it so after using Mana Tide Totem, the cost of your healing spells is reduced by 25% for 15 seconds. A big healing cost reduction added to one of your raid-wide cooldowns is always nice. And the 4 set increases the duration of Spirit Walker's Grace by 5 seconds and gives 30% haste whilst it's active. That'll put Spirit Walker's Grace up to a 20-second duration, and during that duration, you gain your own heroism effect, which is pretty fantastic. For enhancement, your 2 set makes it so while you have any Maelstrom weapon stacks, your Lightning Bolt, Chain Lightning, and heals are 10% more effective, and the 4 set makes it so your Feral Spirits have a 45% chance to grant a stack of Maelstrom each time they deal damage. You should be getting stacks crazy fast while Feral Spirit is active, which should make this into an even more fun burst phase. Finally, Elemental. The 2 set makes Elemental Mastery grant 2000 Mastery for 15 seconds. I have seen some sources which say 1000, but I'm going to go with 2000. In practice, what this does is it adds about a 20% additional chance for Overload to happen during Elemental Mastery. And your 4 set makes Overload grant 250 haste for 4 seconds, stacking 3 times. Just another good passive damage buff for Elemental here, another great set for this spec by the looks of things. And that is the Shaman in Cataclysm Classic. I'd say the biggest winner coming off the back of Wrath of the Lich King for me is Elemental, which goes from a kind of okay utility one-off spec to a real DPS powerhouse. I'm expecting it to be very popular. Resto feels like an evolution of the Wrath of the Lich King version that packs more diverse heals and raid-wide cooldowns. And Enhancement is still a fast-paced spec with a lot going on and can perform fine enough whilst bringing a wide variety of different raid-wide buffs. The Druid as a class really started to come into its own during Wrath of the Lich King. Long gone were the days of being forced into healing or having to deal with the hybrid tax of vanilla, and with 4 specializations to choose from, World of Warcraft's master shapeshifters had really begun to adapt themselves to all areas of content. And moving into Cataclysm, Blizzard began to delve more into the various class fantasies that this class can bring, whether that's tanking, melee DPS, range DPS, or healing. And just in case you are wondering, no, Druid doesn't get a 4th talent tree in Cataclysm just for Guardian. That would be Mists of Pandaria, but the combined talent tree still made both specs work where they needed to. On the other hand, what is new for the Druid is a new race, as trolls can now roll Druid in this expansion. But with 4 specs to break down, the videos covering Druids are always pretty sizable. So let's make a start and talk about how the Druid changes in Cataclysm and how they are expected to perform in this new expansion. First up, I want to cover the baseline class changes. For balance, Fairy Fire now reduces armor by 4%, stacking to 3 times, and there are no longer major and minor armor debuffs either, and the maximum 12% armor reduction can be done by all the usual stuff you'd expect, such as Sunder, Expose, and so on. Insect Swarm doesn't reduce the target's chance to hit anymore, Soothe Animal is gone and is replaced by just Soothe, which removes all enrage effects from an enemy. Thorns is turned into a cooldown based ability and is more powerful instead of being a consistent, albeit minor buff. And Innovate gets a nerf, well, depending on how you look at it, that is. Where it used to give about 7,800 mana to any target in Wrath, now it will grant 5% mana to an ally or 20% to the Druid. This can be improved via talents and glyphs, but as a whole, this ability is now more tailored to being used by the Druid themselves. A new ability for Cataclysm is Wild Mushroom and Wild Mushroom Detonate. Wild Mushroom allows you to place down 3 mushrooms that will become invisible after 6 seconds. Casting Detonate will, you guessed it, make them explode, dealing AoE damage to nearby targets. This is a nice ability to set up damage for times when you know ads will come in for PvE, as well as providing some burst in PvP. Shrooms can also be upgraded via talents to leave a slow feel behind that can be quite powerful too in the right circumstance. That's balance, next is Feral. So Tiger's Fury now increases physical damage by 15% for 6 seconds instead of a flat amount. Savage Roar has been reworked, and it now increases auto attack damage by 80% instead of all physical damage by 30%. Pretty much all cat form abilities such as Ravage, Shred, Swipe and so on now have a much higher percentage base damage modifier, most likely as a result of the Savage Roar change. And Fairy Fire Feral has the same changes as the balanced version does too, where it now reduces armor by 4%, stacking 3 times. Both Cat and Bear have 2 abilities which are new, and just have different resource costs depending on what form you're in. Those are Skull Bash, which is a kick on a 1-minute cooldown, but it has a bit of a longer range, and you can lower this cooldown to 10 seconds via feral talents. And Stampeding Roar, which is 60% move speed for all players within 10 yards for 8 seconds. A very powerful raid-wide ability here, but the 10-yard range is a bit of a killer in terms of actually getting use out of it very often. And no, unfortunately, there is not a glyph or something to improve it either. For Bears, Demoralizing Roar now reduces physical damage of enemies by 10% instead of a flat amount. Frenzied Rejuve has been reworked to be much more of a powerful cooldown too. It will now increase max health by 30%, and it will still convert rage to health. It's basically what Survival Instincts was from Wrath, on top of the heal which it's always had. Savage Defense has also been reworked and is so much stronger than it used to be. Instead of reducing damage from the next attack after you crit, now it gives all non-periodic crits a 50% chance to grant an absorb shield, and Bears basically crit non-stop, so this is going to be a very effective, albeit passive mitigation tool. New to Bear is a proper AoE threat generator in Thrash. This causes instant damage as well as applying a bleed to all nearby targets. And I know Bears were not the most popular pick throughout Wrath. This will be changing in Cata, but we'll talk more about that soon when we get to talents. Over in the Restoration tree, Omen of Clarity is now a baseline ability for all Druids, and it can be further improved via talents. Otherwise, it works the way it always has, where casting or attacking has a chance to make your next ability free. Nourish has moved up from a 1.5 5-second cast to a 3-second one, and is now considered your slow but efficient heal. And Mark of the Wild now has the same buff as Blessing of Kings, meaning it grants 5% stats and some resistances. Tranquility gets a huge buff in Cataclysm and is now a very powerful healing tool that can affect both party and raid members. The healing over time portion of regrowth is more powerful, but lasts 6 seconds down from 21, and Life Bloom's duration has increased from 7 to 10 seconds. New for Restoration is Remove Corruption, which just combines Cure Poison and Decurse into one button. So those are our baseline changes. Now we have the talents. For this, we'll be checking out some builds as well as the most impactful changes to your talent trees. And as much as you've probably heard that Cata talent trees made them smaller or simpler, well, you're gonna see throughout these class videos there is a lot going on here, and tons of interesting gameplay altering changes to look forwards to. We'll start off with the Boomkins again, why not? So the first thing you'll want to know about talents in Cata is when you commit a point to a talent tree, you'll instantly get certain bonuses straight away, and when you're leveling a character, these bonuses will be obtained at level 10. You will also have to spend 31 points in that tree before you can branch out to the other two, which yes, does make there less choice overall, but if we look at Wrath, nearly every spec in the game went down and got their end of talent tree ability, so it was kind of an illusion of choice thing in the end. Anyways, when specking into Boomkin, you'll gain bonuses to arcane and nature damage as well as Star Surge. Star Surge is going to sound pretty familiar if you've been playing Season of Discovery at all, but Cataclysm was when it first came into the game. However, this version of Star Surge does have a cast time, it does do heavy damage, and it will also contribute towards your Eclipse state. Your mastery as a Moonkin is Total Eclipse, which further increases the damage bonuses received when under the effect of either Eclipse state. Your mastery will be learned from your class trainer at level 80, not straight away upon picking your talent tree though, and mastery on gear therefore is only found on Cata content after level 80. So you're probably asking now, what's Eclipse? Well, it's very different from how it was in Wrath of the Lich King, I can tell you that much. But in Cataclysm, if you're playing Boomkin, you're now going to have the very famous Eclipse bar. When casting Wrath, you'll gain Lunar Energy and Starfire Solar Energy. Depending on which one you cast, your Eclipse bar will move in that direction. When it hits 100, you enter Eclipse, causing either nature or arcane spells to do bonus damage until your bar has moved back down to 0 again, and then you cast until the bar hits the other Eclipse state and rinse and repeat. So you're still doing the thing where you alternate between Wrath and Starfire as filler spells, but now you have more control over when your big burst damage happens, as opposed to the Wrath version where you crit, and it can happen at a bad time. In our talents, a lot of things from Wrath have been combined together, so I'm going to try and focus on the new stuff here. Balance of Power now gives spell hit rating from any spirit on gear. This is a change that many casters are going to see in their talents, as Spirit has now been redesigned to a healer mana regeneration stat otherwise. Moonkin form now just flat out reduces damage taken by 15% at all times, making it into a very solid passive mitigation tool, along with its existing effects. Euphoria is a new talent that makes it so you can hit your Eclipse state faster, and it grants you mana when you're doing so. And just below that is Dream State, which is another tool to aid the Boomkin's mana situation. Shooting Stars is one of the most fun talents in this tree, making it so when your dots tick, they have a chance to instantly reset the cooldown on Star Surge and make it instant cast. Solar Beam is another new addition for Cata, which gives Boomkins an option for interrupting. This ability can situationally be very powerful if enemies can be silenced, because you can take them out of action for 10 seconds straight. Also amazing in PvP when combined with roots on casters, it nearly always forces a trinket. Cataclysm is also when Sunfire comes into the game. When entering Solar Eclipse, your Moonfire will change into this spell. It's not the AoE version though, that came in a later expansion. Starfall also changes to only hit things in combat too, and doesn't do that extra bit of AoE damage to stacked targets. Otherwise, it's still a good cooldown to fire off when in Lunar Eclipse. Boomkins run prime glyphs such as Wrath, Moonfire, and Insect Swarm for bonus damage. Next is Feral. We'll start with Cat. So when you pick this talent tree, you will instantly get Mangle, Bear, and Cat, which work basically in the same way that they always have. They're a good damage dealing instant attack, and they apply a debuff. You also gain 25% bonus attack power as this spec. Feral Instincts reduces the chance to be detected whilst prowling, and for your mastery, your bleeds will do more damage. Fury Swipes is a new talent that gives you a chance to instantly attack for high damage every 3 seconds, whichever form you're in. Another new addition is Stampede, which gives you a big bonus after you use Feral Charge. For Cats, your next Ravage will have no positional requirement, will not need stealth, and will be free to cast. Brutal Impact also gets a bunch of updates, and can reduce the cooldown on your Skull Bash down from 1 minute to 10 seconds. Survival Instincts is now your shield wall type effect on a 3-minute cooldown, and reduces all damage taken by 50% for 12 seconds. Towards the bottom we have Blood in the Water. This is kind of your execute phase talent for Cat, making it so when you Ferocious Bite a target below 25% health, Rip is refreshed. This is great for when you can snapshot a powerful Rip effect with procs or cooldowns running. Berserk at the bottom of the tree is the same talent as it was in Wrath, just giving you 50% less energy costs. Cats use glyphs such as Berserk, Rip, and maybe Tiger's Fury. When you pick Bear as a talent tree, you also gain Mangle, of course, and 25% attack power. You also get Vengeance, which is a new addition across all tanks in Cataclysm. This makes it so when you take damage, you gain attack power, which caps out as a percentage of your total health. Well, that's the simple version of it anyways. Just imagine it as being, when I take damage, I do more damage. Your mastery is Savage Defender, which increases the amount absorbed by your Savage Defense. On the talent side of things, Bear makes some different choices to Cats, or gains different benefits from the same talents. Feral Aggression makes Fairy Fire instantly apply 3 stacks, meaning you get a 1-button press instant maximum power armor debuff. Thick Hide now also reduces the chance to be crit by melee attacks by 6%. The reason this is now in the game is that defense as a stat is gone, and not something you're gonna have to be worrying about anymore when tanking. Natural Reaction is just a bunch of stats for free, reducing damage taken in bear form by 18%, increasing dodge chance by 6%, and giving 3 rage whenever you dodge. Pulverize is a new ability towards the bottom of the tree that consumes lacerate stacks, and increases melee crit chance by 3% per stack consumed for 18 seconds, so that'll be 9% melee crit at max stacks. Remember, crit is super good for Feral due to Savage Defense and their mastery, so this is very good. And Berserk works the same as it does in Wrath, causing Mangle to cleave and have no cooldown, but there's also a new and extremely powerful bit of text on this talent, which makes it so when Lacerate ticks, it has a 50% chance to reset the cooldown on Mangle Bear and make it free. Bears run glyphs such as Berserk, Lacerate, and Mangle, and you should expect to see a lot more feral tanks in Cata than you did in Wrath. It'll be a resurgence of them back like it was in TBC, but again, more on that soon. And finally, we have Restoration, a spec that I played back at the start of Cata, and I had so much fun with it then, so let's check out their talents. When you pick this talent tree, you get Swift Mend, which works pretty much the same as it always has done, in that it consumes a heal over time effect to heal a target. It can be glyphed to not do this as well. You get Meditation for mana regen, Gift of Nature for more heals, and Disentanglement allows Resto Druids to shift out of roots and slows. And yes, only Resto Druids can do this now whenever they want. Ferals have to use some cooldowns or get dispelled to escape roots. Your mastery is Harmony, which makes it so your direct heals gain a bonus, and when you cast a direct heal, your heal over time effects are also improved for 10 seconds. You'll want this buff up at all times, but it's very easy to do just through regular gameplay. In the talent tree, Nature's Swiftness now improves the effect of the healing spell it's used on by 50%, so a crit Nature's Swiftness healing touch is going to be an enormous heal. Revitalize gets redesigned and doesn't give other classes resources anymore. Instead, it's a mana regeneration tool for the Druid, which also causes a life bloom to give your raid a bit of mana too. Malfurion's Gift is a huge talent, giving life bloom a chance to proc clear casting and massively reducing the cooldown on Tranquility. Empowered Touch is another big improvement for the Druid, giving bonuses to your direct healing spells and making them refresh Life Bloom on the target, so just a really easy way to keep Life Bloom rolling on your tank. Nature's Cure adds a magic dispel effect onto Remove Corruption, giving the Druid much better dispel coverage, and Druids also get Efflorescence, which is a new and iconic restoration talent, making your Swift men put a zone on the floor that heals nearby allies every second for 7 seconds. Finally, probably one of the more controversial changes for Druid in Cata is that Tree of Life is now a cooldown. Now when it's used, it causes Roots and Regrowth to be instant cast, Wrath to do more damage, Life Bloom can be casted on any number of targets, and Wild Growth will heal 2 extra targets. The biggest problem with this change for me was always the absolute uncanny look of the new tree form. I mean, come on, who saw this and thought, yep, looks great, let's ship it? Either way, you can glyph back to the old form if you really want to. Other glyphs Restoration uses will be Life Bloom, Rejuvenation, and Swift Mend. So those are our class changes and talents, but how are we expecting Druid to be represented in PvE in this post-shattering world? Well, as always with Cata, the answer is going to somewhat depend, and that dependence is on the size of the raid, and more importantly, the difficulty that you're taking on. Whereas in Wrath, players would gravitate much more towards 25-player raids, and in that environment, it's very easy to tick off all the necessary buffs and debuffs. But Cata has both 10 and 25-player raiding on Heroic as both equally viable options when it comes to challenge and the rewards offered. Now, Blizzard did give way more classes the same buffs and debuffs in Cata, but it still tends to be the case that casters buff other casters and physical damage dealers buff other physical damage dealers. This means when you're in a 10-player raid and the content is actually kinda hard, certain specs may be preferred just by the nature of your raid comp. That being said, I think the most in-demand Druid spec in Cata will be specifically for a Feral off tank. Whilst Ferals are just as capable of main tanking, their big benefit, which no other tank can do as well, is the fact that in between actively tanking, they can hop into cat form and still put out some respectable damage. Things such as talents, itemization, glyphs, depending fight to fight, will affect how much you can spec into damage or needing to tank, but this is still a big selling point for Feral. Also, they are the only class in the game to get 2 masteries from 1 talent tree, which is kind of probably hidden OP. They also bring decent buffs and utility such as a combat res and stampeding roar. And Ferals are also pretty simple to play in terms of tanking, and a ton of their mitigation just happens naturally thanks to your mastery and savage defense. They bring good single target threat, much improved AoE threat thanks to a buff swipe as well as thrash, and embody that Druid style of tanking of just being really good at taking hits. So expect to see plenty of Feral tanks in Cata. Next one is kind of hard to pick. It's going to depend on your raid comp again, but I'd probably go for Boomkin. With an updated rotation with way less RNG than the Wrath of the Lich King version of Eclipse, Boomkin enjoyers are probably already looking forwards to the expansion. Boomkins also pack a lot of very unique utility, such as Typhoon to knock mobs back, and the fungal growth talent leaving behind a slow field after wild mushrooms explode can really come in. There's more than just a few fights where this is very useful. The single target and burst AoE should also remain strong points. Honestly, if you liked Boomy and Wrath of the Lich King, I don't see why you wouldn't be up for giving it a go in Cata. And particularly in caster comps, this spec should find a welcome place. I think Restoration also comes a long way from Wrath of the Lich King too. It's just depending on your raid size, the Disc Holy Pally meta is still kind of hard to get away from. But with the overall changes to how healing is approached, where it's much more about getting the most out of your mana, rather than just topping any non-full HP bar, heal over time effects go up in value big time. A problem which Resto Druids will noticeably start to run into though is RNG damage effects which they cannot prepare for in advance. They also show weaknesses on fights more focused around spot healing, large bursts of damage. All the same, I do really rate them as a strong pick for the expansion, and hopefully I'll be playing one as my main ult, but we'll see how things go there. Finally would be feral cats. So first up, the power of having a feral off tank doesn't really do too many favors to somebody who just wants to play cat, as both specs are capable of bringing nearly the exact same buffs and debuffs depending on your spec. It's just one of them can tank and the other cannot. Still, cats can perform, and if you are a long-time feral enjoyer, I don't see a reason to stop in Cata. All that being said, each Druid spec is viable and can perform well in PvE, but as is typical in World of Warcraft, there will be some specs which are more in demand than others. Let's move on though and talk PvP. When it comes to PvP in Cata, no longer is it the case that Arena is the only form of competition to be had, as rated battlegrounds are now in the game. This new 10v10 format of PvP brought life back into old battlegrounds by offering guild experience, conquest points, and the chance to get old PvP titles from vanilla once again. And in this new world, Druid finds a place in many different comps. Balance will be seen for the most part in 3v3 or rated battlegrounds compared to 2v2, as they're more susceptible to being focused down. Big talent additions for PvP are the classic roots into Solar Beam combo on healers. This nearly always forces some kind of cooldown to be burned, and Wild Mushroom with the fungal growth talent can fulfill so many different uses. From sniping a healer trying to drink around a corner, slowing enemies around a pillar or a choke, being used for surprise burst damage and so on. It's just a very versatile ability and talent combo. Another big addition for the boomies is Lunar Shower, which basically opens up a no casting boomkin build. It makes it so when you moonfire, its direct damage done is increased by 45% and mana cost is reduced by 30%, stacking 3 times, lasting 3 seconds. So now you can really just run around spamming moonfire as every other instant cast spell. It does good damage and it'll build you towards an eclipse. I'd say compared to Wrath, boomies get noticeably better in PvP in Cata due to their overall utility, survivability, and damage output on the move. Resto Druid also is in a pretty good spot. Again, in Cata our health bars start getting pretty enormous, so heal over time effects tend to get a lot more value when the game is about control and wearing people down, and not just blasting them from 100 to 0 in a few seconds. Also remember that Resto Druids are now the only Druids that can shift out of route or slows on demand, making them very difficult to lock down for any period of time. And when you finally do close the gap, they have HOTS running, and they can just shift into bear form or pop bark skin to reduce a ton of damage taken. Another thing to know about Cata PvP, which is worth a mention here, is that mortal strike effects have been reduced down from 50% effectiveness to 25%. This is a buff to all healers in PvP of course, but I just thought I'd give it a mention here in case you didn't know. I wouldn't say Resto Druid is an absolute S tier pick in Cata for PvP however, due to being a bit lacking on the cooldown side of things. Nevertheless, they are strong. Which leaves us with Feral, and Feral is the big winner out of the Druid specs for this expansion in PvP. For sure. You still have 2 ways to break out of routes by the way with Dash and Stampeding Roar thanks to the Feral Swiftness talent. You get an Interrupt and a mini gap closer in Skull Bash, Shield Wall from Survival Instincts, a Last Stand effect from Frenzied Regen, and of course the thing that's been Feral's big strength for a long time now, an instant cast Cyclone every time you spend 5 combo points. It's kind of like Blizz took the Wrath version of Feral and just added more damage and solved its survivability problems. So if you PvP a lot, expect to see a lot of Ferals in all brackets in Arena and in RBGs. Let's move on to tier sets, starting with tier 11 from Bastion of Twilight, Throne of the Four Winds, and Blackwing Descent. This is one of those strange tier sets for me because the normal mode version of it with the electric blue looks way better than Heroic to me, which is just kind of brown. But anyway, for Feral the 2 set increases the periodic damage of Rake and Lacerate, giving both Feral identities a rather small extra amount of damage. Remember, all damage over time effects can crit by default in Cata, and your mastery as a cat improves bleeds further. The 4 set makes it so when you mangle in Cat, you gain 1% attack power for 30 seconds, stacking 3 times, so a small addition to your total attack power, but one you'll want to be tracking. For tanks, it increases the duration of Survival Instincts by 50%. So with this tier set, we're talking an 18-second shield wall effect for tanks. For boomies, the 2 set adds some crit chance to your Insect Swarm and Moonfire, so not bad but not too exciting either. The 4 set increases crit chance of spells by 15% for 8 seconds after your Eclipse activates, decreasing by 5% with each crit. This used to be 99% bonus crit, decreasing by 33% with each crit, but it was so good that Blizzard had to nerf it in Firelands. So I wonder if we're going to get back the correct tier set for Phase 1. For Restoration, the 2 set gives 5% crit on the periodic portion of Life Bloom, so just some extra healing there, and when Life Bloom is at 3 stacks you gain 540 bonus spirit. You'll always have Life Bloom at 3 stacks on the tanking Kata, and you'll be refreshing it non-stop, so this is just a bunch of extra mana regen really. Tier 12 from the Firelands looks like it could have been a monk set from the future teleported back to me, and I'm not sure if I'm the biggest fan of it. I guess having an entire raid tier centered around fire didn't fit too thematically well with the Druid class. Then again, in Molten Core they just gave tier 1 some antlers and leaves and called it a day. For Feral, the 2 set makes it so attacks with Mangle, Maul and Shred deal 10% extra fire damage over 4 seconds, so just a nice extra damage over time portion to abilities you're already spamming. The 4 set is interesting, so finishing moves have a 20% chance per point spent to extend the duration of Berserk by 2 seconds. Now I haven't played a Feral Attend game during Wrath of the Lich King, but with Heroism or Berserking and all these other haste procs running, you must already be able to pack a pretty good number of 5 combo point spenders into that window. I'd hope for around 6 extra seconds on Berserk from this, which would mean a 40% extra duration total. The 4 set for Bear makes it so when Bark Skin fades you gain 10% extra dodge chance for 12 seconds. For Moonkins, the 2 set has a chance to summon a Burning Treant to aid you in combat for 15 seconds. According to Wowhead, this has a 20% proc chance and a 45-second internal cooldown, so about a 33% uptime on your fiery friend. And whilst up, they'll be spamming Fire Seed for some minor damage. Your 4 set basically just gets you into your next Eclipse state faster, and it should go nicely with the Euphoria talent as well. And the 2 set for Resto gives each tick of Life Bloom a 40% chance to restore 1% of your base mana each time it heals a target. So that'll be about 186 mana in case you are wondering, and considering Life Bloom will be on the tank and pretty much always ticking, this seems like a pretty good mana restoring tool. The 4 set makes Swiftmend heal a second injured target within 15 yards for the same amount, and no, apparently it does not cause a second efflorescence to bloom on the second target. Still, this seems like a very powerful tier set for the Resto Druids out there. And finally, tier 13 from Dragon Soul. Not World of Warcraft's most popular raid ever, but I kind of like how the tier is presented though. But either way, as we will see throughout these videos, the tier set bonuses in Dragon Soul tend to be kind of crazy good. The 2 set for Feral makes it so whilst Pulverize is active, your Mangle Bear crits have a 100% chance to trigger Savage Defense, so this is just a great extra bit of damage and mitigation for Ferals. For Cat, the 2 set makes it so Ferocious Bite refreshes the duration of Rip on a target with 60% or less health. Pretty amazing tier set bonus here. The 4 pieces are just crazy OP for all tanks, and this set is no exception. It makes your Frenzied Regen affect all raid members, so that's basically last stand on your entire raid. Yeah, pretty good. The 4-piece for Cats makes it so Tiger's Fury also triggers Stampede Cat, or in other words, you get to press Ravage for free every 30 seconds. For Boomies, the 2 set increases the damage of all your direct spells by 3%, and the 4 set reduces the cooldown on Star Surge by 5 seconds and increases its damage by 10%. Not the most exciting for Moonkins actually, but it is increasing your damage all the same. And for Resta, the 2 set makes it so after innovating, the cost of your healing spells is reduced by 25% for 15 seconds. This is great for those moments when you know there's a lot of damage incoming and you can really make the most of it. And for Resto Druids, the 4 set makes it so your Rejuvenation and Regrowth spells have a 10% chance to time slip and have double their normal duration. Kind of goes without saying, this is just an amazing bonus as well, albeit kind of RNG. And that is the Druid in Cataclysm. I think each spec remains fairly familiar to how things play in Wrath of the Lich King. There's there's just a little something extra that you can now do. I do think Druid remains a pick with tons of potential and is still a great choice for someone who wants a main with a bit of flexibility in terms of what roles they can fulfill. I'm definitely considering having a Resto Druid as an alt myself to see how it stands up compared to what I remember from back in the day, but we are going to be playing on the final patch's balance as we always have with Classic, so maybe things will be quite different. Rogue has been a high performer in both PvE and PvP content throughout every version of Classic we have seen so far. In raids it's been all about that consistent damage, and arenas see Rogue shadow stepping and laying down huge amounts of burst damage and CC. And in Cata there's still going to be plenty of spec diversity. However, the big changes that you're expected to go to PvP spec, subtlety, should also now find a place in raiding. Both new races in Goblin and Worgen can roll as rogue, so you'll have plenty of options here. But with that said, let's make a start and check out the rogue in Cataclysm. Up first are baseline changes. In the assassination tree, ambush no longer requires daggers, and exposed armor will reduce an enemy's armor by 12%. This is consistent with all major armor reduction debuffs, and the minor ones don't exist anymore. In the combat tree, Shiv now can remove enrage effects if that's ever needed, and Fan of Knives will require thrown weapons to be used. New for combat is Recuperate, a finishing move that uses your combo points to restore health. This is very good in PvP and is also useful in PvE when you're spec'd into sub. You get combat readiness too, which makes you take 10% less damage from weapon attacks, stacking up to 50% over time if the rogue keeps getting hit. This is kind of like a physical damage reduction counterpart to Cloak of Shadows, but it does also share a cooldown with Cloak. For subtlety, stealth no longer reduces your movement speed, and vanish guarantees 3 seconds of stealth after use. Even if you have dots ticking, you'll still be in stealth. Cloak of Shadows, in addition to its previous effects of removing all magical debuffs, will now make you resist all incoming magical attacks for 5 seconds, so there's no longer that RNG where you can still get hit. New for subtlety is Redirect, which simply moves your combo points from one target to another on a 1-minute cooldown, and Smoke Bomb, which creates a zone around the rogue that you cannot target into or out of. Let's check out some talent trees now and see what else is changed. We'll start with Assassination. Mutilate is basically the same ability, just does a bunch of damage, needs 2 daggers to be used. You get Assassin's Resolved, which when wielding 2 daggers, you'll gain 20 maximum energy and 20% bonus physical damage. You get Improved Poisons for a 20% bonus chance to apply deadly poison and 50% for instant poison. And your Mastery simply increases your poison damage done. In the talent tree, Deadly Momentum is a new great pickup whilst leveling. It has the same effect as Remorseless Attacks in that after you defeat an enemy, your next attack has bonus crit chance, but now it also refreshes your Slice and Dice and Recuperate to their original durations. Quickening has been moved up the talent tree, so it's readily available to other specs, but it increases healing effects on you now as well as your movement speed. An easy 2 points for some great utility. Cold Blood now grants 25 energy in addition to giving 100% crit chance, meaning you can always fire off that max combo point in Venom. Vile Poisons increases poison damage and makes it so Fan of Knives will now also apply poisons to enemies hit at their normal rate. Murderous Intent is new and gives you a kind of execute phase where you swap from Mutilate to Backstab when enemies are below 35% health. Venomous Wounds is new and is honestly one of the best talents in this tree for just about everything. When Rupture or Garrot tick, they have a chance to deal extra damage to a poisoned enemy and you gain 10 energy back. And the big thing is, if an enemy dies with Rupture on them, you instantly gain a lot of energy back. This talent alone keeps your energy good whilst leveling, and it makes target swapping a bit easier as well. Finally, Assassination has a major cooldown, Vendetta. It's a 2-minute cooldown which grants true sight of an enemy and causes you to deal 20% bonus damage to them. Pretty simple to use, you just send this with all cooldowns running, but a nice damage increase all the same. Assassination uses some glyphs such as Mutilate to reduce its energy cost, Rupture for an increased duration, and Backstab for the execute phase spam. Next up is combat. When you pick this talent tree, you get Blade Flurry, which has had big changes. It's changed from a 2-minute cooldown to an effect which you can toggle on and off with a 10-second cooldown, but it has an unlimited duration. However, your energy regeneration will be slowed by 30% whilst it's active. Ambidexterity increases offhand damage and thrown weapon effects by 75%, and Vitality gives you 25% extra energy regeneration and 30% attack power. Your mastery is Mangosh, which makes it so main hand attacks have a chance to grant an extra attack, dealing 100% of a main hand attack. In the talent tree, Improve Recuperate causes this ability to grant an extra 1% max health per tick, and reduces all damage taken whilst it's active by 6%. This can be nice to pick up for a whole variety of scenarios, and the heal over time really does add up. Improved Sinister Strike adds to this ability by increasing its damage by 30% as well as reducing its cost. This will still be your main spammed ability as combat. Reinforced Leather is new and makes you a bit tankier versus physical attacks, and you also get Revealing Strike. This instantly deals damage and improves the effect of your next offensive finishing move by 35%. Adrenaline Rush now increases attack speed as well as restoring energy faster. Restless Blades is new as well, making it so your finishing moves reduce the remaining cooldown on a number of your big other cooldowns, such as Adrenaline Rush and Killing Spree. Bandit Scowl gives you a buff as you hit the same target, increasing all damage by up to 30%. This buff gradually builds up and then falls off. Of course, you want to put as much damage as possible into the window when it's fully stacked, and if you hit another target, the buff will reset. And finally is Killing Spree, which is the exact same as in Wrath. You instantly attack several nearby targets for bonus damage. Combat takes prime glyphs such as Sinister Strike for the extra combo points, as well as Adrenaline Rush and Slice and Dice just to buff their duration. And of course, for once in PvE, we're going to be talking about Subtlety. When you pick this talent tree, you get Shadow Step, which increases the damage of only Garrote or Ambush by 30%, still only usable on enemies with a 25-yard range. Master of Subtlety makes attacks while stealthed and for 6 seconds afterwards do 10% more damage. You also get Sinister Calling for 30% more agility, and this also increases the percentage damage bonuses on Hemorrhage and Backstab by 40%. And your mastery is Executioner, increasing the damage of all finishing moves and the effectiveness of Slice and Dice. In the talent tree, Improved Ambush makes this ability have a very high crit chance and buffs its damage by 15% too. Opportunity further buffs pretty much all of your big damage dealing abilities by 30%. Energetic Recovery is another important new talent. This makes it so when Recuperate ticks, you gain 12 energy. Find Weakness also gets big buffs in Kata, making it so your stealthed attacks reduce the target's armor by 70% for 10 seconds. Honor Among Thieves now gives a raid-wide 5% crit buff, and any crits from raid members will add combo points to your target on a short cooldown. Sanguinary Vein is new as well, increasing damage dealt to bleeding targets by 16% and making it so gouge won't break from your bleeds. And Slaughter from the Shadows is a huge energy cost reduction for your main damage dealing abilities. Finally is the iconic Shadow Dance, which is the same as Wrath. You can use your stealth abilities whilst not in stealth for 6 seconds. Sub takes prime glyphs such as Hemorrhage for the bleed, Backstab for some energy, and Slice and Dice to increase its duration. So then, how are we expecting rogues to perform in PvE throughout this expansion? Well, let's begin with combat. Its place in Wrath of the Lich King was often for that 4% physical damage taken debuff, but now you're going to have people queuing up to play Arms Warrior, so that's not going to be much of a concern anymore. So the main thing you're going to be bringing is damage, because the rest of your utility is similar to other rogue specs. Where combat does excel over other rogue specs, however, is specifically on encounters where you can get a lot of value out of Blade Flurry. Since this ability is now a toggle, you could leave it on for an entire fight if you wanted to, and it's going to be super important that you do get value out of Blade Flurry to make combat worth playing. At the same time though, you are quite adverse to actually swapping target because of Bandit Scowl, and you need a main target which you can continually cleave off of. With cooldowns running and 2 targets to hit for long enough, combat can put out some good sustained burst and damage, but that's kind of their niche in Kata. As such, it's quite a fight dependent spec which will otherwise fall short when compared to some other choices. Assassination is going to feel real similar to Wrath, and if you want a pretty straightforward spec which can put out numbers, it's going to be a good choice. You do have a DPS cooldown now in Vendetta, as well as caring more about maintaining gaining bleeds thanks to venomous wounds. Your Fan of Knives applies poisons too, which is a nice extra benefit, and when enemies are low you get an execute phase 2 to mix up the gameplay a bit. Oh, and also if an agility dagger drops, you kind of just automatically get them, which isn't a bad bonus for playing the spec either. I think Assassination will overall be the most represented rogue spec in Cata, and should be a good, consistent pick from start to end. And then there is Subtlety, perhaps the most anticipated rogue spec for Cata, so it's gonna work in PvE now, right? Well, more so than it's done in the past, that's for sure. For me, this is a real wild card pick for the expansion. I don't think it's gonna properly take off and feel consistent until we're quite progressed into the expansion, for sure though by the time you have your legendary daggers and we're in Dragon Soul. For me, it's objectively the most challenging rogue spec to play by a very long way, and if things go wrong, your DPS suffers a lot. You're gonna have to maintain Recuperate for the energy regen, a bleed for Sanguinary Vein, Slice and Dice for the attack speed buff, and weave in Eviscerate too. And then you have Shadow Dance coming up once per minute, which will enable Find Weakness and a 70% armor debuff. During this time, it's vital that you've planned ahead and you're not refreshing your maintenance buffs, and you're spamming as much damage as possible. Oh, and also, Subtlety's AoE is just non-existent compared to other rogue specs. This is really a single target spec. I think this spec will be an option for well-practiced players on certain fights, but for the majority of Cata, I think Assassination is going to do just fine, and not wanting to play sub shouldn't have you missing out. Next up is PvP, and whilst there's a bit of variety in PvE, there's really only one spec which stands out for this area of content, and that is without a doubt Subtlety. As one of the top melee picks for PvP in Cata, the sub-rogue packs a huge amount of utility and damage. Notable changes from Wrath are that Redirect allows the rogue to move their combo points from one target to another for some really quick target switching. Shadow Step and then redirecting into Kidney Shot is a 6-second stun kind of out of nowhere, and that can apply a lot of pressure. In PvP you also have more room to re-stealth, leading to more openings with Find Weakness on different targets. And of course, Shadow Dance gives you a huge amount of both burst and utility through stuns and silences. But perhaps your biggest tool this expansion is the iconic Smoke Bomb. Once you've got someone's trinket out and they can't escape a hard CC, Smoke Bomb can feel impossible to recover from. It's an instant ability which basically creates your own line of sight field around you for 5 seconds, meaning opposing healers and casters can do very little to help. And the crazy thing is, you can even glyph preparation to make it reset the cooldown on Smoke Bomb as well. Rogues can also get improved Recuperate and Energetic Recovery, which means you passively take 6% less damage, and you gain 4% of your max health and 12 energy every 3 seconds. This is just a ton of stats for free. So yeah, Sub-Rogue is pretty nuts in Cata. If you're a melee PvP enjoyer, this is a spec to consider for sure. On to tier sets next, starting in tier 11 with the Wind Dancer's Regalia. The 2 set is a simple 5% bonus crit chance to backstab, mutilate, and sinister strike, and the 4 set makes it so auto attacks have a 1% chance to make your next eviscerate or envenom a critical strike. I mean, rogues do attack a lot whichever spec you're playing, so with some decent RNG, you might get a few procs of this per fight. Tier 12 is the Dark Phoenix set from the Firelands. The 2 set makes your melee crits deal an additional 6% fire damage over 4 seconds, and the 4 set makes your Tricks of the Trade give a 25% buff to one of your combat ratings for 30 seconds. The ratings affected are crit, haste, and mastery. So you press Tricks on cooldown and you get a massive 25% buff to one of your secondary stats. This is a huge tier set bonus, but I imagine rolling the right stat will create quite a bit of variance on how much damage you can do. Last, of course, we have tier 13 from Dragon Soul. The 2 set makes abilities cost 20% less energy for 6 seconds after having used Tricks of the Trade. It seems like Blizzard really wanted you to feel good about pressing tricks in Cata. And the 4 set increases the duration of your big cooldowns for each spec, proportional to how often you can have them active. And for Shadow Dance in particular here, if you were to glyph it and had the 4 set, it would go up to a 10-second duration. Maybe that and the legendary daggers would help the spec out a lot in PvE. And that is the Rogue in Cataclysm. It keeps a spot as an absolute top tier PvP pick, whilst also getting a few more options in PvE. I think for the most part it'll be Assassination as the go-to spec, but combat may have the odd fight where its ability to cleave can put it ahead. Subtlety in PvE is a high skill cap pick which takes practice to get to grips with, and also needs an encounter where basically you can just single target something. I think this is one of the more difficult specs to judge as for how well it's going to do, but just know that it should be an option. From summoning demons to straight up becoming one, Warlock is a pure DPS class that can either deal tons of damage through their minions or wither targets down with damage over time effects. In Cataclysm, this is one of the classes that undergoes one of the largest baseline class reworks, though I would say it still remains pretty similar to the class we know so well. There's plenty more choice for your preferred race in Warlock 2, as both new races in Worgen and Goblin can roll as this class, as can Dwarf on Alliance and Troll on Horde. But there'll be plenty to get through today, so let's make a start on the Warlock in Cataclysm and see how good they were back then. Let's begin as always with the baseline class changes which we have. So first up, soul shards as a physical item in your bag are no longer a thing. You now have up to 3 shards as a resource, and they are displayed just below your character panel. Soul shards are now used for certain powerful spells, as well as the new spell Soul Burn. More on this in a moment. I have to say, as somebody who's played Lock for the vast majority of Classic, as thematic as shards are, when you began doing more difficult PvE encounters, you could legitimately begin to run out of shards because you were spending more than you could recover during a wipe, and in this scenario they did start to get somewhat annoying. Also, PvE doesn't exactly start to get easier in Cata or anything, so no doubt this issue would have been exacerbated as time went on. In the Affliction tree, a life tap now converts 15% of your max health to 120% of that value in mana. Curses have now been split into Curses and Banes. Curses are utility spells such as Weakness, Tongues, Elements, and so on, and Banes are focused around dealing damage, such as Agony or Doom. This means, of course, you can now have one of each active at the same time. Doom now ticks once per 15 seconds with a chance to summon a demon each tick, and its cooldown has been removed. And Drained Soul now generates 3 shards if the target dies whilst being drained. New for Affliction is Dark Intent, so you and a target gain 3% haste. When either one crits, the Warlock gains 3% to periodic healing and damage, and the target gains 1%, stacking 3 times. So overall, when it's stacked up, you're looking at a 3% haste buff and 9% periodic damage for the lock, and 3% haste as well as 3% periodic damage and or healing for the target. Pretty important buff, and your casters are going to be fighting over who gets this. Out of the 3 lock specs, Demonology has the most changes. You now have one button where you can summon all your demons from instead of them being separate spells, and your demons will automatically train spells as you level instead of you needing to go back and buy them grimoires. There's also been a few general changes to the pet commands UI, including Pet Assist, where your pet will just attack what you are, and Move To instead of Stay, so you can command your pet to go to a location. Your Imp has Flee, which instantly moves it to the Warlock's position, as well as Singe Magic, which is just a Dispel magic. Voidwalker's Consume Shadows now gains Stealth Detection whilst it's active. Succubus has Whiplash, which is an AoE that knocks back enemies by a small amount. Fell Hunter's Fell Intelligence now causes targets to regenerate mana every 5 seconds instead of increasing spirit. And Summon Doomguard and Infernal are now major cooldowns for all Warlock specs that share a 10-minute cooldown. Both of them will last 45 seconds and will attack enemies affected by your Bane spells. Infernal's more for AoE and Doomguard for single target. Soul Link is now a baseline ability, diverting 20% damage taken to your demon, and Soulstones can be used to revive targets similar to how Rebirth works, in addition to their previous use. However, in-combat reses are limited to 1 per fight in 10 and 3 in 25. Fell Armor no longer scales with Spirit, and Soul Shatter doesn't use a shard anymore. New for Demonology is Soul Burn, so this will consume one of your soul shards to empower your next spellcast, with a whole variety of effects. You can Soulburn to reduce the cast time of Drain Life by 50%, summon a demon instantly, gain a 50% move speed buff after using Demonic Circle, make your Soulfire instant, give Searing Pain bonus crit chance, and causing your health stone to increase max health by 20% for 8 seconds. You also have Soul Harvest, which generates 3 shards and heals 45% of your health over 9 seconds. You precast this when you need shards before fights, and it's good in PvP to heal up a bit. You also get Demon Soul, a new 2-minute DPS focus cooldown. This empowers the Warlock depending on your active demon, lasting 20 seconds. Your Imp will improve critical strike chance of all casted destruction spells by 30%. Voidwalker will transfer all threat generated by the Warlock to the Voidwalker. Succubus will improve Shadow Bolt damage by 10%. Fell Hunter improves periodic damage by 20%. And Felguard increases spell haste by 15%, as well as fire and shadow damage by 10%. Last we have Destruction. Not too many changes here for a change. Soulfire will no longer use a shard, and Shadow Flame actually does some damage now. New for Destruction is Fell Flame. This deals a small amount of damage and increases the duration of Immolate or Unstable Affliction by 6 seconds, but not beyond the original cap. This is good for when you're on the move and you need a button to press, really. Let's check out some of the new talents now. When you pick the Affliction tree, you get Unstable Affliction, which is unchanged. It does damage over time, as well as heavy damage and silences if dispelled. You gain 30% shadow damage, and your mastery simply increases the damage on periodic spells. Jinx is a new talent that makes your Curse of Elements also affect up to 15 targets within 40 yards of the target it's on. This makes it so if you're missing this debuff, you have an easy way to apply it to multiple targets. Soul Swap is another new and iconic addition for Affliction locks. This one deals damage to a target and removes your active dots from them, and then you can recast Soul Swap on another target, and this will reapply all the dots you just removed from the first target. This is of course a great way to target swap really fast, but you can also glyph this to have a 30-second cooldown and to leave your dots on the main target, which makes multi-dotting way easier. Soulburn Seed of Corruption makes Seed apply corruption to all nearby targets when it detonates. This scales up super well with Nightfall and Glyph of Corruption, both of which make it so when your corruption ticks, your next Shadow Bolt has a chance to be instant. Pandemic has been changed and now reduces the global cooldown on all Curse and Bane spells by half a second, and your Drained Soul also refreshes Unstable Affliction on targets below 25%. Everlasting Affliction also causes Haunt and Drain spells to refresh Corruption too, so when you're getting into that execute phase, you have to worry much less about your other dots. Finally, we have Haunt, which is pretty similar to how it was in Wrath, a casted ability which increases all periodic damage effects you deal to the target. Affliction considers prime glyphs such as Haunt to boost its damage amp up a bit, Corruption for more Nightfall procs, and Unstable Affliction to reduce its cast time. When you pick the Demonology talent tree, you gain Summon Felguard. However, it's got a few new tricks now in Cataclysm. Cleave has been replaced by Legion Strike, which applies a Mortal Strike type effect and splits its damage between enemy targets. Axe Toss is a 4-second stun, Intercept has been replaced by Pursuit, which is just a move speed increase, and of course you have Fellstorm, which is basically Warrior's Blade Storm, but on your demon. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, transmogging your Felguard's weapon through glyphs was a thing in MOP, not Cata, so you're gonna have to hold on to that Corrupted Ashbringer for a while longer. You also get 15% bonus fire and shadow damage as Demonology, and your mastery increases all damage done by demons, including yourself when you're in Metamorphosis. In your talents, Fel Domination is gone, and you now have Demonic Rebirth that gives you a 10-second window to resummon your demon after it dies once per 2 minutes. Impending Doom is new, increasing the chance that Bane of Doom will summon a demon by 30%, as well as giving a bunch of spells a chance to reduce the cooldown on meta. Molten Core is still there, giving Immolate a chance to buff your next 3 Incinerate casts, and Hand of Gul'dan is a brand new ability for your rotation. This calls down a meteor to deal damage to a target, and increases their chance to be crit by any Warlock demon by 10%. Ancient Grimoire increases the duration of both Infernal and Doomguard, and Decimation makes Soulfire into your execute ability. Inferno is new and enables you to channel Hellfire whilst moving. Cremation adds a further 30% damage to Hellfire, and it will cause Hand of Gul'dan to refresh Immolate on your main target. Demonic Pact has been changed to just give raid members plus 10% spell power instead of a value scaling with the Warlock's own spell power. And finally, we still have Metamorphosis in Cata. We've got a while yet before Demon Hunters come along and steal it. But in Cata, it's pretty similar to Wrath. The only big difference is Demonic Charge has been replaced with Demonic Leap, which is just Heroic Leap really. Other than that, it's just really about Immolation Aura and the damage amp it gives you through your mastery. Demonology would consider prime glyphs such as Immolate and Incinerate just for some more damage on these important abilities, as well as Metamorphosis to increase your big cooldown's duration. So, how are we expecting the Warlock to fare during Cata Classic? I expect them to have two very viable PvE specs, and then the other one, Destruction. I reckon Destruction will be in a similar position to where it is in Wrath, where it's actually a good spec, it can do respectable damage and beat plenty of other DPS classes, but the question is, when Affliction exists and is better on multi-target, and Demonology exists and is better on single target, why would you? Destruction still doesn't have any special debuffs either that aren't likely to be covered by another class. And at the end of the day, if you want to be brought to a raid, you do need to bring something to the raid yourself. Still, I'm sure there are people out there who will look to play it, but I just don't believe it will be a meta pick in Cata, and we'll talk more about Destruction when we get on to PvP. Affliction was the go-to Warlock spec that was stacked for much of Wrath of the Lich King, but now it definitely has some competition. Affliction should be playable, but it's somewhat more dependent on fights where you can get high value from things such as AoE Corruption from Seed of Corruption, Nightfall procs, Glyph of Soul Swap, and, well, just multi-dotting stuff, basically. Affliction still does fine enough on single target and has a strong execute phase too, so if you enjoyed Affliction in Wrath, it's a pretty similar playstyle, and hitting multiple targets is just straight up easier. Then again, I wouldn't expect to be as consistently high on the damage meters as you were in Wrath. The big meta shift, quite literally, this expansion will be with the Demonology Warlock becoming what I believe will be the most popular spec, with Felguard updated to have a lot more power, a mastery buff to all demons, including the Warlock when transformed, and Doomguard becoming a significant single target DPS cooldown. The demo locks stand to gain a lot in Cataclysm. They have one of the best opening burst phases when you send all your big cooldowns in at once, and their AoE burst is also very good. You can combine Immolation Aura, Hellfire on the move, and Fellstorm all at the same time. I reckon Warlocks will start off strongest early in the expansion though, and don't scale quite as well as some other casters, notably the Fire Mage, but nevertheless they'll remain a strong pick for Cata if you are after a pure DPS class. Let's move on to PvP and talk a bit about Destruction first. So when you pick Destruction you gain Conflagrate, which is pretty similar to how it's always been in that it instantly deals damage, but it doesn't consume Immolate or Shadow Flame at all now. You get Cataclysm, which is 25% bonus fire spell damage, and your mastery increases your fire damage even more. In the talent tree, improved Soulfire is new and increases fire and shadow damage dealt by 8% for 20 seconds after having used Soulfire. Remember, you can soul burn now for an instant Soulfire, so this is an extra bit of burst that Destruction can put into their kit. Shadow burn is still there, of course, and no longer costs a shard anymore, thankfully. And you can also glyph it, so if it fails to kill a target, its cooldown is reset and then it's put on a 6-second cooldown. So in other words, you can do it twice in a row. Backdraft has been updated to include Chaos Bolt, allowing Destruction to put out even more burst in a short space of time. Burning Embers adds a dot from your Imp's Firebolt and your Soulfire, and Nether Ward is also changed so that Shadow Ward will instead absorb all spell damage now. You also get Nether Protection, which gives a 30% damage reduction against any spell school when you absorb damage through any means. And finally is Chaos Bolt, which is still the same as it is in Wrath, except it's going to be hitting a bunch more thanks to it benefiting from your mastery. We have a few things worth mentioning in the Demonology tree here as well, such as extra stamina from Demonic Embrace, healing your demon through Fell Synergy, and being able to res your pet instantly for free once per 2 minutes. Destruction though is in a somewhat similar state to Wrath. If you let it sit there and cast spells, they are going to absolutely demolish people, but it is more vulnerable to getting trained down and hard focused. Warlocks do have Soul Link by default now, but other than that your defensives are Netherward, Deathcoil, Shadow Fury and Demonic Circle. I've no doubt there are people out there who will make this work, but I think it's a bit higher skill cap purely through how well you need to know matchups and how you need to understand trading cooldowns, because when you make a mistake it could be super punishing. Affliction is of course also a strong contender for Arena in Cataclysm as well, and there aren't too many changes from the PvE build here. Notable inclusions are Curse of Exhaustion for a movement speed debuff, and improved Howl of Terror for that AoE fear effect. Affliction can be somewhat vulnerable if trained down as well, but where it shines over Destruction is just in the amount of damage you're putting out. This spec goes super well into damage over time heavy pressure comps, where you aim to overwhelm the enemy team the longer the game goes on. Soul swapping via the glyph from one fully dotted target to another is just a massive amount of pressure that comes out of nowhere, and locks can do this once per 30 seconds. The fact that curses and banes are different things is also big in PvP, as you can have a Bane of Agony running for damage, whilst also annoying enemies by spamming Curse of Tongues on them. Skilled Affliction locks will make this class look super unfair, but beginners will probably get clapped by physical damage cleaves. It's a very strong spec, but it needs to be well piloted. Let's check out some tier sets. We'll start with tier 11, the Shadow Flame Regalia. The 2 set reduces the cast time of Chaos Bolt, Hand of Gul'dan and Haunt by 10%, and the 4 set gives periodic damage from Immolate and Unstable Affliction, a chance to cause your next 2 Foul Flame abilities to do 300% more damage. So overall some more damage, and a decent proc on one of your new spells to make it deal some proper damage now and again. Tier 12 is the Bale Spider's Burning Vestments from the Firelands. The 2 set gives your damage a chance to spawn a Fiery Imp to assist you in combat for 15 seconds. Quite a few DPS specs have this kind of proc on their 2 set, and it's just a bit of bonus damage on a 45-second internal cooldown. The 4 set gives your main filler or execute spells a 5% chance to increase all fire and shadow damage dealt for 8 seconds. A pretty small proc chance, but when it happens this is a huge bonus, and one you'll want to be tracking for sure. Finally, we have the Vestments of the Faceless Shroud from Dragon Soul. The 2 set on this is massive, increasing the duration of Doomguard and Infernal by 30 seconds, and reducing their cooldown by 4 minutes. That's going to put them up to a baseline duration of 1 minute and 15 seconds and a 6-minute cooldown, so if you're on a longer boss fight, you're going to get more than one use out of them. The 4 set makes it so Soulburn gives 10% spell power for 10 seconds after it's cast, and causes Soulfire to refund a shard. So in other words, you get an instant cast Soulfire once per 10 seconds, and you get a permanent 10% damage buff for doing so. Pretty amazing set overall, especially for Demonology. And that is the Warlock in Cataclysm Classic, a class that I reckon I'm gonna be spending a good amount of time on. With a number of viable PvP and PvE specs, good damage output, and an even better Demonology spec, there's a lot to look forwards to here. The Mage has been a mainstay DPS class throughout Classic so far, excelling at just about everything in Vanilla, remaining a top pick in TBC, and in Wrath, wouldn't you know it, Mage turned out to once again be pretty great. In fact, Mage has probably been one of the most consistent picks across every version of Classic we've played so far, and it looks as though someone at Blizz back in the day really liked their Mage, because in Cata, Mage takes things to another level once again. You also have more choice for your Mage enjoying in Cataclysm. Both new races in Worgen and Goblin can roll this class, as can Dwarves, Night Elves and Orcs. Whether it's for PvP or PvE though, you'll find plenty of opportunity to be a top tier pick. So let's check out what's new with the Mage and how they changed in Cataclysm. Up first we have what's new to this class baseline, as in the non-talent related things. Arcane Missiles turns into a proc that can happen when you cast any other offensive spell. Evocation now grants 15% mana instantly, followed by 45% over 6 seconds. Sometimes you really just do need that one tick of evocation, so this is a small change, but when it matters, you'll notice it. Arcane Blast changes once again because it just wouldn't be a WoW expansion without this spell changing. It still stacks and it increases its mana cost with each stack, however now it reduces the cast time of Arcane Blast by 0.1 seconds per stack, as well as increasing the damage of Arcane Blast and Arcane Explosion by 10% per stack, lasting 6 seconds. Casting Arcane Barrage will instantly end this effect though. So the difference compared to Wrath is the cast time reduction on Arcane Blast with stacks, and the fact that you can use Arcane Explosion as an AoE and not lose the buff. Mana Shield now has a 12-second cooldown but costs 1 point of mana per damage absorbed, down from 1.5. And Arcane Intellect is gone, as are similar single target buffs, and they've just been replaced by their raid-wide variant. Also, they don't need reagents to cast anymore. For Mage, they'll have Arcane Brilliance, which increases max mana and gives 6% bonus spell power. Remember, now in Kata, mana directly gives spell power. Mage Armor now regenerates 3% mana per 5 seconds, and its magic debuff reduction is changed from 50% to 35%. New to the Arcane tree is Mage Ward. This is your Frost and Fire Ward combined into one ability, and it will now also absorb arcane damage as well. Finally, probably the biggest spell mages are getting this expansion, Time Warp. Pretty simple in terms of what it does though. It's the same buff as Bloodlust or Heroism, giving 30% raid-wide haste for 40 seconds, but now you don't always need to bring a Shaman to get this buff. Not too much has changed in the Fire tree. Molten Armor no longer scales with Spirit to grant extra crit anymore, and new to the tree is Flame Orb, which projects a fiery orb forwards that deals damage to nearby enemies over 15 seconds and can be modified more through talent trees. Frost also remains pretty similar to its Wrath of the Lich King state. Ice Armor is gone and now you just have Frost Armor, which has similar slowing effects that it always has done, however now it reduces physical damage taken by 15% on top of that. New to the Frost tree is the pretty iconic Mage utility spell, Ring of Frost. It's instant casting Cataclysm, but it takes 3 seconds to activate, kind of like a trap. Any enemy that tries to cross the ring will be frozen in place for 10 seconds. More applications in PvP for this ability is a CC chain, or just to deny an area, but it's another tool for mages to control a battlefield. Next up, let's check out some talent trees and see what we have. We'll do Arcane first. When picking the Arcane talent tree, you get access to Arcane Barrage, which is unchanged from Wrath of the Lich King, in that it launches an instant missile that deals arcane damage, except it does a bit more damage in Kata. You gain 25% bonus arcane damage, and your mastery is Mana Adept, which increases your damage output based on how much mana you have unspent. Improved Arcane Missiles now increases the number of missiles this spell fires by 2, and Missile Barrage makes Arcane Missiles fire every 0.5 seconds by default. Incanter's Flow is buffed to increase spell damage by 20% of damage received, up from 15%, and it also knocks nearby enemies back when Mana Shield is broken. When Arcane was popular in the past, I remember mages going to stand in bad stuff so they could stack up Incanter's shield, so this may well be good. Improved Polymorph makes it so when a poly target is damaged, they are stunned for 1.5 seconds. This makes target swapping a bit more dangerous in PvP, but this talent is of course just available for Arcane mages. Nether Vortex is an all-around amazing utility tool that automatically applies slow to targets hit by your Arcane Blast. Talents like this are what make Arcane into a pretty good leveling spec for Kata, which it really hasn't been known for in the past. Improved Mana Gem now gives you some bonus spell power when using your Mana Gem, and finally is Arcane Power. It still gives 20% bonus spell damage and increases the mana cost of spells by 10%. Arcane would consider prime glyphs such as Arcane Blast, Mage Armor, and Arcane Missiles. When you pick the Fire tree, you get the iconic Pyroblast, which is a long cast time ability that deals heavy damage, and in Kata, it does a decent damage over time effect too. You get 25% bonus fire damage as this spec, and your mastery is Flash Burn, which increases the damage of periodic fire effects. In the talent tree, Firepower increases the damage of all fire effects and causes your Flame Orb to explode for extra damage at the end of its duration. Impact changes from a PvP talent to one of the most important bits of your toolkit to understand. It gives your damaging spells a 10% chance to reset the cooldown on Fire Blast, make it stun for 2 seconds, seconds, but way more importantly, it also causes any fire damage over time effects to spread to nearby targets. This is what can cause Mage to do unreal numbers on AoE when you have a big combustion ready to fire off. Speaking of combustion, it's important to talk about this ability too, since it's been reworked. Now combustion combines all your active periodic fire effects on the target into a new damage over time effect, but it does not consume them. So imagine the scenario, you've got a big ignite running, you've got your pyroblast dot, you've got a living bomb, you use combustion which copies them all into a new dot that combines their damage, and then you have an impact proc which spreads every single damage over time effect to all nearby targets. So yeah, this version of Fire Mage we have in Cata is pretty good. Cauterizes new, makes it so taking damage which would otherwise kill you will set your health to 40%, after which you'll take a lethal damage over 6 seconds, which needs to be healed or shielded. It's basically cheat death, just what one of the strongest PvE specs in the game needed. Thanks for that, Blizz. Blast Wave is now a ground targeted ability rather than something that fires out from where the mage is, and you now have both Hot Streak and improved Hot Streak. So Hot Streak is a chance after your fireball crits to make your next pyro instant and free, whereas the improved version is what you have in Wrath of the Lich King now, where when you score 2 spell crits in a row with direct spells, you always get a free pyro. Scorch is now free and castable on the move thanks to improved Scorch and Firestarter. Improved Flame Strike is another huge talent for the Mage's AoE toolkit, making Flame Strike instant cast and causing Blast Wave to also fire off a Flame Strike for free if it hits 2 or more targets. Pyromaniac is changed too, and it now gives 10% spell haste if 3 or more targets are on fire at the same time. Finally, we have Living Bomb. Living Bomb is pretty much the same as it is in Wrath, but now it's limited to 3 targets. Fire Mages pick up glyphs such as Pyroblast, Molten Armor, and Fireball. So those are our baseline changes and some talents rounded up, but how are we expecting to see the Mage perform in PvE this expansion? Well, for a start, you'll have noticed I just didn't cover Frost for PvE, and similar to how Frost has been since, well, vanilla now really, this spec is once again centered around PvP, and I'll be getting onto it in a moment. As for our 2 remaining specs between Arcane and Fire, you should see some variety here. Typically, Arcane has been the go-to spec towards the start of a new expansion, because Fire just needs a whole bunch of crit to get going. But I feel as though this time around Arcane's reign may be a bit more short-lived, because the version of Fire Mage which exists in Cata is just that good. Arcane's niche is on-demand extremely high burst. In Star's World First Spine of Deathwing, for example, Arcane Mages were stacked super hard for this reason, and maybe we'll see this meta make a return when we finally get to Dragon Soul, but honestly, most of the time I think you're going to be seeing Fire Mages. And this is a great expansion for that to be the case, because Fire is a complete monster in Cata. Not only does it do great damage on single target encounters, but when you can cleave or do mass AoE, a good combustion into impact setup with some RNG on your side can simply do unreal amounts of damage. Cataclysm really builds on Wrath of the Lich King Mage gameplay. You keep the hot streak and big crits gameplay, but now you also gain mobility through scorching on the move. You have better AoE with Blast Wave and Flame Strike, and the super satisfying moment of setting up a huge combustion. And you have cheat death as well for some reason, because why not? Do note, however, and this is something which does go for all casters by the way, but worth considering, Cataclysm has some legendaries, and one of them is something every single caster will want, called Dragon Wrath, Taragosa's Rest. And the short version of what this weapon does is that it has a chance to duplicate spells, which kinda goes without saying, but that is very powerful. You'll be wanting this on Fire Mage for sure, but expect heavy competition, and you can start working towards that when we get into the Firelands. All in all though, Mage, particularly Fire, is expected to do very well this expansion, and should be a popular pick. PvP's up next, and here we'll be talking about Frost and Fire. Frost first. When you pick this talent tree, you get Summon Water Elemental. This is now a permanent summon for Frost Mages. It still just casts Water Bolt and has a ranged Frost Nova called Freeze similar to what it's always had. You'll get 25% bonus frost damage for picking this tree, and 15% bonus extra damage to Frostbolt too, and your mastery increases all damage against frozen targets. In the tree we have Early Frost, which reduces the cast time of Frostbolt by 0.6 seconds every 15 seconds, allowing for some good initiation on fights. Shatter now multiplies the crit chance of all spells against frozen targets by 3, and adds even more damage to Frostbolt. Improved Cone of Cold has been reworked and is now way more powerful, and it adds a 4-second freeze effect to this spell. Permafrost adds a 10% healing debuff to frost damage, and causes your damage dealt to heal your water elemental as well. Fingers of Frost has a new effect to increase the damage of Ice Lance whilst active, and improved Freeze makes it so your water elemental's freeze now always generates 2 charges of Fingers of Frost. Frostfire Orb changes Flame Orb to now have a slowing effect on it, and your final talent is Deep Freeze, which is the same as Wrath, and it instantly freezes and stuns a target for 5 seconds. Frost will look for glyphs such as Frostfire, Ice Lance, and Cone of Cold. There's quite a few new talents here, or old talents combined together, but the playstyle of Frost Mage in PvP remains pretty similar to how it's always been. You control fights with the likes of Polymorph, Counterspell, your roots and snares and stuns, and then set up huge burst windows through chain freezing targets with cooldowns running. Oh, and one more thing you should know, heroism type effects are disabled in Arena as of Cata, so sorry, you can't run an RMP with Time Warp. Fire is also playable in Cataclysm across a wide variety of PvP content. Whilst Frost is about control and burst, Fire is more about mobility and pressure. Some important talents to highlight here are Blazing Speed, which when hit by a melee or ranged attack has a 10% chance to proc. When it does proc, you gain 50% move speed and dispel all effects which prevent movement. Molten Shields also causes Blazing Speed to proc from the use of Mage Ward 2, just giving the Fire Mage even more mobility. Fire should be a highly mobile spec, able to CC on the move from Impact Stun, Counterspell, Dragon's Breath, and improved Cone of Cold. It brings great damage because, it's a Fire Mage, and once again, you have Cheat Death in Cauterize, which is just super useful. It's definitely more squishy than Frost, but can excel when played well in Cata. Overall though, mages are going to find themselves with more than one spec to play in PvP, and plenty of viable options for pushing arena rating or RBGs. Next up we have our tier sets, so first tier 11, the Firelord's Vestments from Throne of the Four Winds, Bastion of Twilight, and Blackwing Descent. And yes, the set called Firelords is not from the Firelands. I don't know, go figure. Anyways, the two set 5% more crit chance on basically all your big proc spell effects. 5% more crit on Pyroblast though? Yes please, that sounds very good. The 4 set reduces the cast time on Arcane Blast, Fireball, Frostfire Bolt, and Frostbolt by 10%. Again, seems very good for Fire, as it does for Arcane really, and more Fireballs mean more chance to get Hot Streak running. Not the most exciting set bonuses here, but they're functional. Also the set looks pretty cool I think. Tier 12 from the Firelands is the Firehawk Robes of Conflagration. The 2 set has a chance to summon a mirror image for 15 seconds that casts fireballs at your target with a 45-second internal cooldown, so just a minor DPS increase here. For the 4 set, your spells have an increased chance to trigger Brain Freeze or Pyroblast. According to Wowhead user Canaria, who it seems themselves was doing a bit of Cataclysm research, they estimate this could be as much as a 30% flat increase to the proc chance of Hot Streak, and this 4 set could kind of be incredibly broken going into Firelands with the 4.34 Fire Mage balancing. This will be a space to watch once mages start hitting their 4 set. The 4 set will also make it so Arcane Power will reduce the cost of spells by 10% instead of increasing them. Finally, we have the Time Lord's Regalia from tier 13, Dragon Soul. Brings out the Chronomancer type vibes with this one. I'm a big fan of this set. Also, as per usual with Dragon Soul tier set bonuses, this one is kind of insane. The 2 set makes it so when you cast your filler spells, you gain 50 haste, which stacks up to 10 times. And when your Arcane Power, Combustion, or Icy Veins fades, you lose these stacks. The losing of the stacks only really makes sense once you've got the 4 set though. This makes it so each stack lost reduces the base cooldown of each of your spec's big cooldowns, such as Combustion, by 5% per stack. So in other words, you want to be at 10 stacks by the time your big cooldown is finishing, and then a significant portion of its cooldown will be removed. This should only be problematic at the start of a fight where it may be difficult to get to 10 stacks, but as you go on and progress into encounters, this is just straight up giving you a bunch of haste and allowing you to pretty much use combustion every minute or so. So this sounds kind of incredible. And that's the Mage in Cataclysm, a true successor to Wrath of the Lich King's Mage, I would say. Expect this class to be top tier in both PvE and PvP throughout the expansion. Okay, maybe it's going to need a bit of time to scale towards the start of tier 11, but it'll be worth the wait. If you enjoyed your Fire Mage a lot in Wrath, just give this a go. It's a no-brainer. Fire Mage is probably one of the most fun caster specs in the game and can pull off some incredibly satisfying gameplay through combustion. In PvP, choices are a bit more varied than Wrath 2, with Fire now becoming way more mobile and being able to get a lot done whilst on the move. I expect Mage to be a very popular pick in Cata, and if you're considering a pure DPS caster class, you should absolutely have Mage as a strong consideration. Light and Shadow, healing or damage. The Priest is a class you'll always find at the core of raid groups or at high rating in PvP, and you better believe that is not about to change in Cataclysm either. With tons of talent changes, iconic new abilities, and overall some more engaging gameplay, the Priest remains a top pick this expansion. There's gonna be far more to Discipline than just mashing Power Word Shield. Holy gets to empower single target or raid heals, and Shadow starts to blast on DPS meters. You'll also get a bunch more choices for race when it comes to Priest. Both Worgen and Goblin can roll as this class, as can Gnome and Tauren. So let's make a start and check out what's changed with the Priest in Cataclysm and see how good they were back then. Up first, we're checking out our baseline changes to each spec. So up in the Discipline tree, Inner Fire now lasts forever and increases armor by 60%. In addition to giving spell power. A nice general change here if you ever forget to buff this, or in PvP for example when you're being focused and maybe don't always have the global to refresh it. Dispel Magic will now only remove one effect from enemies by default, down from 2, and new to Discipline is Inner Will. This is exclusive with Inner Fire and reduces the cost of instant cast spells by 15% and increases movement speed by 10%. Over in the Holy Tree, the general healing rework that's affected all healers is of course here. Heal is now your slow and efficient minor heal, Greater Heal is your slow and efficient big heal, and Flash Heal is your fast and inefficient big heal. New to Holy is going to be a crowd favourite Priest ability, Leap of Faith, or Life Grip, whichever one you want to call it. A 1.5 minute cooldown to instantly move a target to your position. This is a very high skill expression ability. You can pull off all kinds of saves with this, from getting somebody out of a bad spot in PvP, to preventing someone from being knocked off a ledge or out of a mechanic in PvE, or anything in between. On the Shadow tree, Shadow of Death now deals 3 times damage to targets below 25% health and still causes damage back to the Priest if the target doesn't die. Mind Seer can now be channeled on allies, which is a great bit of quality of life. You can now just Mind Seer off the tank instead of having to try and tab between enemies, and in PvP you can tab on your ally when looking for that enemy rogue. This also makes Mind Seer much better at dealing with very low health enemies too. New for Shadow is Mind Spike. This ability does damage to a target and increases the crit chance of Mind Blast by 30%, stacking 3 times. However, in Cata, unlike Season of Discovery, using this ability also removes damage over time effects from the target. The point of this ability is to give Priest something to use on targets which aren't going to live for a very long time, or to allow fast target switching in PvP. So overall, your Priest baseline toolkit is pretty familiar to what you have in Wrath, but it's the talent trees where things are going to change. When you pick Holy, you get Holy Word Chastise, which at face value is just basically a PvP ability, but there is a talent to modify it to make it into a healer tool, as we will will see in a moment. You also get 15% bonus to all healing effects, 50% of mana regen from Spirit continues in combat, and your Dispel magic will remove 2 effects when used on allies. Your mastery is Echo of Light, causing your direct heals to also place a heal over time on the target for a percentage of the initial amount healed. In the talent tree, we've got quite a few changes here. Renew gains several separate talents dedicated into making it better, including just healing more, giving it an instant heal portion, and its GCD being lowered. Lightwell is still in the game and can contribute some heals to your raid, but the big addition we have for Holy is Chakra. Cataclysm is the expansion where the Holy Priest gets to choose a healing style from fight to fight, so they always have the tools they need to deal with whatever's incoming. When activated, your next single target heal will cause you to enter Chakra Serenity, which increases the crit chance of direct healing spells by 10% and causes them to refresh renew on a target. Your Holy Word Chastise will also turn into Holy Word Serenity, which is a powerful instant cast heal that further increases critical effect of healing spells on the target by 25%. Alternatively, you can enter Chakra Sanctuary by using an AoE heal after pressing Chakra. This increases the healing of AoE spells by 15% and reduces the cooldown of Circle of Healing by 2 seconds. During this state, your Holy Word Chastise also gains a new effect where you can put down an AoE healing field on the ground that will heal all targets within it over 18 seconds. It's knowing how fights play out and where big damage will be incoming to which targets that allow Holy Priest to set up the correct chakra and to have powerful abilities to fire off. This playstyle is core to Cataclysm's Holy Priest, and it should be something you enjoy though. You also still have Spirit of Redemption of course that allows you to keep healing for 15 seconds after dying, but combat reses are more limited in Cata compared to Wrath, so you can't really play too heavily around this. Serendipity allows you to stack up a buff when using faster heals to make your next big heal better, and Body and Soul is situationally still very useful. It adds a 60% movement speed effect to Power Word Shield for 4 seconds, and also causes Cure Disease to remove a poison on yourself. A few last talent points here are worth a mention, such as Heavenly Voice. This increases healing done by Divine Hymn by 100% and reduces its cooldown by 5 minutes. Divine Hymn is your big raid-wide cooldown, and this allows you to often get more than one off per fight and just have it heal a lot more. Circle of Healing is still there of course and will prioritize the most injured target. And Guardian Spirit is still the final talent tree ability, now improving heals on the target by 60%, up from 40% in Wrath, and otherwise works in the same way, as in if the target it's on would have died, they will instead be resurrected with 50% health. Holy Priest will consider prime glyphs such as Guardian Spirit, Renew, and Prayer of Healing, depending on whether they need to focus more on raid healing or single targets. Next up is Discipline, a spec which really started to gain a lot of power throughout Wrath of the Lich King, and in Cata is going to still be a mainstay in all raid comps for sure. When you pick Disc, you get Penance, still castable on allies or enemies for healing or for damage, very similar to Wrath. Enlightenment gives you 15% bonus intellect, and similar to Holy, you continue to regenerate 50% of mana during combat, and Dispel effects will remove 2 effects on allies. Your mastery is Shield Discipline, which simply makes your shields better. We do still have some talents that buff up shields, such as improved Power Word Shield, as well as Soul Warding to reduce it down to a 1-second cooldown. The difference is really in the mana cost, it's just too expensive to spam. Evangelism and Archangel give you a stacking buff which can be consumed to restore mana and increase healing for a short time. It also gives you some mini wings as well, which look pretty nice. Another big new addition is Atonement. This is where the DPS healer hybrid all began. When you deal damage with Smite or Holy Fire, a nearby target will be healed for 100% of the damage dealt. Do note it only works in a 15-yard range though. Inner Focus has had a mini rework. It now reduces the cost of either Flash, Binding, Greater, or Prayer of Healing by 100% and increases their crit chance by 25%, but it's lowered to a 45-second cooldown down from 3 minutes. So no more Inner Focus Divine Hymn, but you still have some good options and you can use it a lot more. Power Infusion is unchanged and increases casting speed by 20% and lowers mana cost by 20%. And Pain Suppression is still your big single target external cooldown, reducing a target's threat by 5% and reducing all damage taken by 40% for 8 seconds. Train of Thought is new and makes it so Smite reduces the cooldown on Penance by 0.5 seconds and Greater Heal reduces the cooldown on Inner Focus by 5 seconds. This just keeps your big spells coming off of cooldown more often, so it's a nice pickup. The big new addition for Disc though has to be their final talent, a huge raid-wide cooldown that they were definitely missing in Wrath of the Lich King, and that is Power Word Barrier. You summon a barrier at the target location for 10 seconds, and all targets within take 25% or less damage for its duration. I mean, do I need to say anything else? This alone is a reason to bring a Disc Priest for many fights with high spikes of damage. It's an incredibly powerful cooldown to have, and an iconic tool for Disc Priests over the years. Disc would consider prime glyphs such as Penance, Power Word Shield, and Barrier. Last but not least for the priest specs is Shadow, and again it's kind of familiar to Wrath, but there's definitely more than just a few interesting additions here. When you pick Shadow you instantly get Mind Flay. You get 15% bonus Shadow spell damage and 100% bonus crit damage on Shadow spells. It's worth a general mention here too that all periodic effects in Cata scale with haste and crit by default, so no need to worry about talents which specify those things being gone from the game. You also get Shadow Orbs, which needs a bit of explaining because it's kind of a wall of text. So Mind Flay and Shadow Word Pain ticks have a chance to grant a Shadow Orb. You can have 3 of these at once. When you Mind Blast or Mind Spike, you spend all your stored orbs, and whichever ability you use does 10% bonus damage per orb. For 15 seconds after having spent your orbs, you do 10% more periodic shadow damage. So basically, you do your rotation, you get shadow orbs, you Mind Blast to spend these orbs, and then you do more periodic damage and just repeat. The periodic damage on this is the big bit of the effect, but it should keep itself running just through natural gameplay without you having to really worry about it. I guess for this mastery, Blizzard wanted to go for something more interesting than just your dots do more damage. So here we are, and your mastery itself will increase the damage of Shadow Orbs. Simple enough so far, let's look at some talents. Veiled Shadows has been moved up the tree and still reduces the cooldown of Fade and Shadow Fiend. In fact, a bunch of priest specs will end up using this talent. Twisted Faith makes it so Spirit will now be converted into Hit, and can more or less be seen as an interchangeable stat should you pick up any gear with Spirit on. Shadow Form remains similar to its Wrath version, but now also gives a 5% spell haste buff to your party or raid. Harness Shadows increases the chance to generate Shadow Orbs and guarantees you get one when critically hit. Self-healing from Vampiric Embrace is nerfed down to 6% for yourself and 3% for other party members. And this is one of the very few party-wide effects left in the game as well. Masochism restores mana when hit by an attack which deals 10% or more of your max health, or when damaging yourself with Shadow Word Death. Mind Melt makes it so Mind Spike reduces the cast time of your next Mind Blast by 50%, stacking up to 2 times, as well as making Shadow Word Death do even more damage. Sin and Punishment is new and is a big talent both in PvE and PvP. It causes targets to run in horror when Vampiric Touch is dispelled, and makes it so Mind Flay crits reduce the cooldown on Shadow Fiend. Shadowy Apparitions is another big talent for Shadow Priests too. When your Shadow Word Pain ticks, you have a chance to create a shadowy version of yourself that moves towards the target and deals damage when it reaches them, with a higher proc chance whilst moving. And finally we have Dispersion, which is the same as it is in Wrath, reducing damage taken by 90% and restoring mana. This makes Shadow Priest an amazing candidate for any soaking based mechanics in PvE, and is a get out of basically anything free card in PvP, only on a 2-minute cooldown. So how are we expecting the Priest to fare in PvE throughout Cataclysm then? Well, in many ways I think it's going to look quite similar to how the meta was in Wrath. Holy Priest I would say does definitely get more powerful, but they're in a bit of a strange spot between a hybrid raid and tank healer. And when you're in a raid in World of Warcraft, you kind of just want a spec to be very good at one specific thing. This is why raid comps are a big deal in the first place. And for Holy Priest, there are definitely better options for tank or single target healers, and though their raid healing is more competitive, it can be hard to match up against, say, a Resto Druid for instance. I do have to say I doubt people looking to build out meta raid comps will often prefer to take Holy Priests, but depending on encounter difficulty, raid size, and of course player skill, a Holy Priest should be capable enough in the right player's hands. Discipline is going to be kind of like Wrath in that I expect it to be the most popular healer spec for priests once again. The way disc heals is kind of unique in that they're the only healer that stops damage from ever happening. Every other healer has to restore health bars. When you're a disc priest, they just don't move that much in the first place, and that's kind of an overpowered style of healing. In fact, I think disc actually limited healing design space pretty heavily between Wrath and Warlords of Draenor, because bosses needed to hit hard enough to factor in for the existence of disc priests. But yeah, that's a whole separate topic. It's not only the way that disc heals, but it's that they also pack some incredible utility spells as well, such as power infusion, pain suppression, and of course now barrier. If you played disc throughout Wrath of the Lich King and you were looking over to Paladins with their divine sack, which was always such a big deal, you know how huge having a raid cooldown can be. And when you're all under the barrier, being grouped up for a little bit often even isn't a bad thing. You can stampeding roar afterwards to reposition, and in Cata there's a bunch of healing effects which do want people to be stacked, such as Efflorescence, Light of Dawn, Healing Rain, and more. And it's worth a mention that Atonement is good in Cata and you will be using it to heal, but it's nowhere near the strongest version of Atonement that's ever existed in World of Warcraft. So you should expect to be using your regular heals in addition to DPSing. But yeah, Discipline is going to remain very popular and for good reason. And then we have Shadow. So Shadow so far has been a very good one of spec in your raid since the Burning Crusade really, but it's always just been a one of, and I think it's going to continue to do that. Where things change is that Shadow should be more competitive on DPS meters. Typically they're pretty much always middle of the pack, but given player skill and especially suitable multi-die encounters, I do hope to see them shine at times. I don't think you should roll a Shadow Priest and expect to be topping meters. You're gonna need to wait for Legion Classic and Surrender to Madness for that, but they're still a great pickup for any raid with their unique utility and great damage profile. If you've been a Shadow Priest enjoyer throughout Classic so far, I think you'll like the additions to Cataclysm though, and would recommend giving it a go. In PvP content, priests continue to perform well as both DPS and healers. In this instance though, Discipline really is the go-to spec due to both their expanded utility pool compared to Holy, but also in their ability to do damage when you're going all in. Some notable talent inclusions here are Strength of Soul, which makes you immune to Interrupt, Silence, and Dispel effects for 5 seconds after having used Inner Focus, which is amazing for those moments when you yourself are getting focused. Remember, Inner Focus now is a 45-second cooldown, so this is going to be up pretty often. Focus Will also changes a bit compared to Wrath, but it has the same idea behind the talent. Whenever you take over 10% of your total health or are crit by any direct attack, you gain 10% damage reduction, stacking twice. And when people start hitting you, this stacks up kind of instantly. Priests are also definitely a healer that can go on the offensive with Smite, Mind Blast, Holy Fire, Shadow of Death, Shadow Fiend, Penance, and of course Evangelism to add even more damage. You've got Leap of Faith, which can come in super clutch to remove somebody from an all-in, and priests still have tons of other utilities such as Dispel, Mass Dispel, Mana Burn, and the list just goes on and on. This spec is really good, and it's like an extension of the Wrath of the Lich King Discipline with just even more tools to play with. Shadow also sees improvements and has some huge new talents to really push it to the next level. Sin and Punishment has to be the biggest one. You finally having some Dispel protection on your Vampiric Touch is such a big deal, and it makes both of the Dispeller and nearby targets run in horror for 3 seconds. That makes it into a serious threat. And being Shadow, you still of course have things such as Silence and Psychic Horror for more CC. You've got talents such as Harness Shadows and Masochism that even give you bonuses for moments when you're being focused and you can't cast as much as normal, such as restoring mana and granting Shadow Orbs. And of course you take Dark Evangelism over in the Discipline tree as an all-in tool and an offensive cooldown, which typically Shadow isn't really known for having. Shadow should see widespread play across a bunch of comps, or at least I know it did back in the day. Perhaps things will be different on final patch balancing. Either way, Shadow Priest for PvP and Kata should be a good time. Next up we have our tier sets, starting with the Mercurial set from tier 11, that being Throne of the Four Winds, Blackwing Descent and Bastion of Twilight. This tier set gives a bit of a twisted, almost Twilight Hammer type vibe, but I guess that's pretty fitting going into Cataclysm. The 2 set increases the crit chance of Mind Flay and Mind Seer by 5%, which is a fine enough bonus, albeit not terribly exciting. The 4 set increases damage of shadowy apparitions by 10%, so it's increasing their damage a bit. It depends what type of encounter you're doing as for how much impact they will have, but it's adding a bit of damage to you nevertheless. For healers, the 2 set increases the crit chance of heal by 5%. Both priest healers will be using this as their go-to slow and efficient heal. Discipline also loves crit thanks to Divine Aegis converting 30% of crits on heals into a shield, which scales with their mastery too. The 4 set basically reads you have 540 extra spirit all of the time, whichever healer spec you're playing, and spirit is now a pure healer stat which regenerates mana, so more spirit equals more mana and more heals. Tier 12 is the Cleansing Flame from the Firelands, a zealous sounding set for the priests in this one. I have to say they've done this style of face guard on a few different tiers over the years, and I always reckon it's an easy hide helm for me. Apart from that, looks alright. For DPS, the 2 set reduces the cooldown on Shadow Fiend by 75 seconds and causes it to do 20% extra damage as fire. So with Shadow Fiend talented and this 2 set, you're already down to a 2-minute 45-second cooldown Shadow Fiend, and when Mind Flay crits, you reduce this by a further 10 seconds each time. So that's gonna mean a lot more Shadow Fiending. The 4 set makes it so when all 3 of your main dots are active on the target, your Mind Blast does 25% more damage. This should always be active when you're DPSing a primary target, and is just a bit of extra damage in your rotation. It seems like a solid tier set for the Shadow Priests. For healers, casting a number of spells causes you to regenerate 2% of your base mana every 5 seconds for 15 seconds. This should math out to about 411 mana a tick, and with some of the fights being on the longer side in Firelands, this bonus will add up over time, especially when you can maintain it pretty easily through standard play. The 4 set makes it so when casting a helpful spell, you have a chance to summon a flame that will heal a near injured party member. So I went and checked on Wowhead and it reckons this has a 5% proc chance with no internal cooldown. And all things considered, this seems like a very powerful 4 set bonus. Finally, the Dying Light set from Dragon Soul, which looks like something you'd see in a FromSoft game to be honest. The DPS 2 set makes Shadow Word Death deal 55% more damage, and it reduces the damage you take from it by 95%. This sounds pretty amazing, but Dragon Soul tier sets just tend to be that good. The 4 set makes it so Shadow Fiend and Shadowy Apparitions have a 100% chance to grant you 3 Shadow Orbs each time they deal damage. In practice, this will mean your Mind Blast is always getting the maximum possible bonus out of Shadow Orbs. The 2 set for healers makes it so after using Power Infusion or Divine Hymn, the cost of healing spells is reduced by 25% for 23 seconds. That's a huge discount for your heals for a very long time, and Discipline gets to benefit from both of these back to back if they want to, because Disc still has Divine Hymn. It's a baseline ability, not wholly exclusive, whereas Holy cannot get Power Infusion. The 4 set makes Power Word Shield have a 10% chance to absorb 100 more damage, and increases the mana granted by the Rapture Talent by 100%. It also increases the duration of Holy Word abilities by 33%. So again, Discipline gets the better end of this deal. 33% extra duration on Sanctuary is nice and all, but this is just so much extra healing and mana for Discipline. And that is really everything I have for the Priest in Cataclysm. As it stands and I think Holy Priest is a bit of an underdog spec, and I want to see if people can make it work, and if there end up being any fights where it's legitimately a good choice over Discipline. I think the Chakra gameplay is a lot of fun, and you just have so many healing buttons to press that it feels really rewarding when you get it right. Discipline still has lots of emphasis on absorbing damage, but now also has the damage dealing aspect to it as well, so you're going to be making the most of your full toolkit as a healer. There's a lot more to this spec than just spamming power word shield now, that's for sure. If you do that, you're going to be going pretty fast. Shadow's gameplay is also looking to be pretty amazing. You now have a mini cooldown in Dark Evangelism, something to do direct damage with from Mind Spike, and even just nice quality of life things such as being able to Mind Sear the tank. But let me know what you think, whether there's anything big that you'd add here to the video, and whether you're considering the Priest for Cataclysm Classic in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you on the next one very soon.